Hi, this is Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri. In these United States, show business is just that support for the show is gratefully received at Subscribestar and Public Bitcoin Wallet. I probably need to add some things, getting some consultation from some folks. In particular, Substack seems to have become a really good for whatever reason, people like it. And then that's all I wanted to say about that. And then, oh, well, let me bring on Ryan Turnipseed. Hello, sir.
Hello, how are you?
You're busily becoming I'm thinking of like Pinocchio, like you're becoming a real economist, a real boy, right?
Yeah, yeah,
um,
that's the plan with what I'm doing. I'm
yeah,
supposed to be submitting an abstract for the Austrian Economics Research Conference, uh, basically tonight. And then if I get
right.
accepted, I'll be presenting a paper there.
That would be so cool. Give me a really strong excuse to go, which I kind of want to, I kind of am hoping to do anyway. But anyway,
Yeah.
um, so I just want to mention two things, Ryan, that I've been kind of rabbit trailing on about this, which I don't think I'm going to bring into this series, but I just thought it was worthwhile for anyone who's finding this interesting to point to some resources on the topic of the 60s and the 70s in America, left-wing radicalism, the Black Power movement, all this kind of stuff. First of all, there's a great podcast I can recommend called Martyr Made. It's a little unclear to me where he's coming from, but I don't worry about that so much. I think I'm listening to a series called God's Socialist, which is about Jim Jones, or the People's Temple. This would be the thing that ended up in the mass suicide, which I didn't even think about it, but I was reading about that and it said that was the biggest, what did it say? Not an act of God, Americans killing, dying uh, prior to 9/11, because so many people died in Jonestown in Guyana.
Right, and
Yeah,
it might also be worth noting, if anyone has caught you and I, Stephen, on other channels, we actually talked about him on the Evangelical History stream that we did with Academic Agent. We gave very brief background, so if you
yeah.
wanted to know more about the crazy cult guys that we were talking about after World War II, Martyr Made would be good to go to. And I was also recommended, they did a podcast on, or a show or whatever they do, on West Virginian labor history and the violence surrounding that, which we did a show
Ah,
somewhat touching on a
yeah.
while ago,
Because of
but they went into much more detail.
the Highlander Folk School, wasn't that what it was called?
Well, that was the civil rights, but we did an
Oh,
episode
okay.
on the Knights of Labor and everything surrounding them, and all the coal mining strikes and fights and all this other stuff.
Right.
Probably a few months ago now. Um, if I remember correctly, they come out on side of the strikers and the more socialistic leaning ones. I don't know if we would necessarily reach the same conclusions, but the information is good.
Yeah.
I trust our audience can develop their own opinions.
Right. And so for God's Socialist, and by the way, these Martyr Made series are absolutely epic. I haven't counted up how many hours it is. I'm only on to part 3 out of 7 or 8 or something. Anyway, it just goes on and on. Each one is like 3 hours long, so it's 20 plus hours of content. So he definitely doesn't just talk about Jim Jones. He talks about the civil rights movement. He talks about the civil rights movement transforming into the Black Power movement in the mid 60s, the role of Eldridge Cleaver, the rise of the Black Panthers, all really important background to both the Weathermen, which we were already talking about, and we'll finish up briefly today, as well as our main topic today, which is the Black Liberation Alliance. They are a direct offshoot of the Black Panthers, as we'll see. So that whole story is, it's like we kind of know it, because like I think autobiography of Malcolm X. I don't know if you had to read that, but I think I feel like I must have read that for school at some point, or maybe I just chose to read it. But it's often
Yeah,
assigned, I
I
think.
don't think they'd push that in school. It kind of breaks a lot of their narratives. Maybe
Does it?
MLK would be something they would assign.
Oh no, I thought autobiography of Malcolm X was commonly read in schools, but I may be wrong about that.
Really?
Anyway, yeah, I have to
Oh,
check on that. But yeah, to audience, tell us, did you read autobiography of Malcolm X as part of schooling? Um, oh, Satirist says sound is fading in and out. Yeah, please someone tell me if the sound does not seem right. It's looking okay on my board here. Um, Anyway, so in Jim Jones, it turns out, was an early civil rights activist himself, very big on racial integration, and as uh, the Martyr Made guy says, if it hadn't been for what happened at Jonestown, Jim Jones would probably be remembered as a important civil rights activist. Um, and that's sort of a stunner if you've only heard the end of the story. So he really is giving full weight to the whole arc of Jim Jones' life, including his activity in the 50s and the 60s and his integration activity and so forth. Oh, good. It's sound is sounding good now. One other thing along these lines, again, we could go on forever with this left wing terror series, and I don't want to. I wanted to sort of bring your attention to various things. I think what we're doing with Days of Rage, which, by the way, Martyr made quotes from Days of Rage regularly throughout the series, so he thinks it's a really good source also. But uh, not very exciting cover here because I don't have the pretty cover, but this is Zebra by Clark Howard. It covers, I just got this book, so I know roughly what's in there, but haven't read it yet. It covers the zebra killings. This was October 1973 to April 1974. A group of 4 black serial killers in San Francisco killed at least 15 people and injured more, possibly killed a lot more white people, I believe. And they called themselves the Death Angels. And I believe, I need to read the whole book to be sure. I believe that they were motivated by Nation of Islam type ideology. Which, by the way, Ryan, I was reading up on Nation of Islam and did not realize that they, at some point, like the Mormons, decided that their doctrine had been revealed to be different, and they cooled it with the white people are demons stuff. And now they talk about the brotherhood of man and stuff like that. And that's been true for some decades, which comforts me because we had a Nation of Islam family stay at our Airbnb, and I always wondered, like, were they believing we were demons or something? But I don't think they were, based on what I just read. But that was certainly the case back in the 70s, and before that, that's where you have Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, and you have the zebra killings from some people who, I guess, took it very seriously that you should just kill white people because they were just, they weren't really humans. The white people are just like demons or something.
yeah,
Um,
and it's really weird how that happens because you have in other in post-colonial states, you had a sort of resurgence of Islam basically after the colonies were disestablished, which provided a great narrative for especially Marxism to intermix with Islam, which is why I know a few people descended from hardcore Islamic Marxists that were in, say, the Soviet Union and Central Asia. Um, and for whatever reason, maybe it's because of the fervor attached to Islam, the excessive violence allowed, um, anything like that that you wouldn't necessarily find in Western Christianity, but broader Christianity at all. It's a sort of historical oddity that you know the black slaves that have lived in the Christian country, or the descendants of the black slaves that lived in the Christian country, adopt this religion that had been foreign to them for who knows how many generations, just because mass media, easier transportation and communication, and sort of like intellectual narratives made it convenient or perhaps heartfelt
Hmm.
to adopt Islam as sort of the mode of liberating from oppression. That's probably one of the stranger things to happen on American soil.
Yeah, right. Especially if you know the whole history of Islam, um, in relation to sub-Saharan Africans. But anyway, um, uh, let's turn now to wrapping up the Weather Underground. And for those who caught our abortive show last week, forgive us for doing some repeat information, but we're going to get rolling. And in particular, I'm really excited for Ryan to hopefully our technical problems are not don't happen this week, and we can get Ryan's input on some fun stuff here, like Leonard Bernstein. I'm hoping you have a few comments to
Oh
make when we
man,
get to that part.
yeah,
But anyway,
and
hold it
not
back.
just
Hold
me,
back.
but yeah.
Oh,
I
go
mean,
ahead.
Mr. D, our good friend, would
Oh,
probably have a lot to say about Mr. Bernstein as well. If you ever catch him ranting, that might be something
ah,
for one of you all to go and prod him on.
oh, nice. Okay. So there's a reason I started by mentioning that turn of the civil rights movement to black radicalism. I've already emphasized it in the previous episode that focused on the Weather Underground, but I just want to remind you as we transition talking about the Black Liberation Alliance that all of this is happening, including the Weather Underground, or the Weathermen, in the context of the civil rights movement, in the wake of the civil rights movement and the turn towards black radicalism. What Brian Burrow in Days of Rage, which we're drawing from here, what he emphasizes again and again is that the mostly Jewish, mostly middle class, mostly college student uh, membership of the Weathermen, they're if you ask them what they were about at the time, they would have been very clear on the answer. They would not have said, they would not have talked about the war, or at least at first about being hippies or something like that. They were about supporting the Black Revolution. They were about Black liberation, which surprised me. I'm really glad we covered this topic, because I would have said that they were blowing things up because they were against the Vietnam War. But that's just not true. That's not what they would have said. That was not their motivation. And he goes even further, and Burroughs says at points, looking at the things they say and stuff, that they just frankly wish that they were Black Panthers.
I mean,
They were
that's the case with
basically
a lot of these groups.
they were basically jealous that they were not Black Panthers. Yeah.
Right.
Oh, you're
Yeah.
saying that's a pattern? What do you mean?
Well, with this sort of like new leftist operation that we're dealing with here, because these left wing groups that come out of the civil rights foundation that you see laid in the 50s and 60s, they aren't your classic Marxists that you would have found in Russia a few decades earlier. They thrive off of oppression narratives across racial boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
across not just class boundaries. They're not the classic Bolshevik. So what usually happens in a lot of these cases is whenever you find a new leftist from their words, the occupier class or the occupier race or the occupier category, whatever it is, that's sympathetic to the broader new left movement of wherever they are. Usually, what everything they do boils down to, they just wish they were the oppressed class because then they would have, more something. It depends on who
Oppression,
you're talking about.
oppression points or something. Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
Right.
right. Yeah, and in this case in particular, there are a lot of groups in American history that are being rewritten right now because it's just now making a lot of history books, at least for the last few years now, that are being called anti-war protesters when in reality their main core philosophy was much more than just anti-war protesting. The Weathermen are one example. The broader hippie movement, I'm sure many people would be aware, was not just about attacking warfare. It had many, many more implications and
Yeah.
practitioners behind it. So that's
Yeah.
something else that's being sort of changed right in front of your very eyes, especially for you, Stephen, being as you got to witness at least some of this.
Yeah.
In most history books, hippies are now just the anti-war protesters, and they had
Hmm.
some weird social ideas, but they were anti-war protesters.
Hmm. Right. Right. So, as I recounted in the previous episode on the Weathermen, they got ready to start blowing things up, and then immediately blew themselves up in the townhouse disaster in Greenwich Village. Hope I'm saying that right. Um, and there were 5 people there. 3 of them died in the blast. 2 women got away and went on to continue to be terrorists. um, and But it did kind of give them pause, and they had to figure out how to make bombs without blowing themselves up. They also, to their credit, and I do want to mention this because we're going to see a change here. They would warn people. They'd place a bomb and then they'd call it in and say, "We put a bomb in your building, and you better get everybody out because it's about to go off." And so I don't remember, but I don't recall that the weathermen killed anybody with their bombs. I should know this.
I mean,
Sorry.
I'm sure I knew a week ago, but that's
Yeah.
the impression that I left with as well. Is they were
Yeah.
more about you see a lot of critiques from the weaker right wing critiques is that these leftist revolutionaries are in their class conflicts end up killing more of the poor or the working class or the middle class than they do the rich class.
Mm-hmm.
Um, with the Weathermen, though, I think they probably had it at least more straight than some of the other groups. They were destroying capital
Mm-hmm.
for their from their oppressor class,
Right.
at least by their own narrative. Um, Now, it is very strange then that they would target the big thing that they're known for that we would go into, being as they had this straight for so long, which might point to a change in philosophy, perhaps.
Right. So what happened then? They cooled off on their bombings. They kind of took a break. They listened to Bob Dylan's new album, New Morning. That'll be relevant. Uh, that had just come out that year. This is late 1970. We're started picking up the story, and the good news from their point of view is that protest bombings were actually on the rise. Um, there were 330 in 1970, almost one a day, which was more than the 3 times the number reported in 1969. But it wasn't what the Weathermen had gone underground to spark. They wanted to spark real revolutionary activity, and the bombings that were happening were kind of one-off student range bombings. They were not, they had not inspired the formation of new underground groups. I mean, I hope I'm not overstating this, Ryan, but what they and the Black Liberation Alliance, what they were about was they were really hoping to do like a Cuban Revolution thing. They were hoping to
Yeah.
they were trying to be military in a somewhat
Yes.
ham-handed way, right? But that was the intention. They were trying to do military things and spark others to do military things such that there could really be a revolution and really an overthrow, right?
Yeah, the whole strategy behind this was if you go underground and you don't get caught or surveilled or something like that, you can just build up long enough on your own little group to be very damaging, and then other people can see that with the same
Yeah,
sympathetic goals and emulate it. So you would have
exactly.
the ideal plan was you would have basically like sleeper groups all across the United States that had been training for some sort of lefty revolution, that were ready to go out and murder and kill and shoot and bomb, coordinated in some way, shape, or form. And then, once the infrastructure is set there and these people are ready, it just takes one spark and the whole country will go up in flames, is the ideal from their point of view. Uh, I'm sure we'll talk about how it ended up.
Right. So, and I am forgetting, but there was a Madison bombing, which he's saying that, which I probably covered already. I'm trying to remember why this was so bad, but um, it was sort of a disaster for the Weathermen. It it gave them bad press. And sorry, I'm forgetting what happened there, but um, uh, it says he says the Madison bombing had done incalculable damage to the group's cause, at once repelling would-be allies and demonstrating that public tolerance of radical violence was on the wane. In a Gallup poll that winter, so this would be late 1970, I think, only 8% of college students surveyed expressed a highly favorable view of Weathermen. And then I had to share this for your sake, Ryan. While 47% had a highly unfavorable view, 1 point less than the highly unfavorable view students had for the ultra conservative John Birch Society. So
Yeah,
they were down there with the John Birch Society. So that's not good for them, right? Um,
right. And it's well, this point that I'm about to make will become more clear as we go on. But a lot of these groups just they sort of viewed this as like a compounding effect. The more violent they would get, or the more flashy or ostentatious they would get with their demonstrations or bombings, the more people would like them, and it would build up momentum, and then eventually the system would just be overthrown. And with that, of course, either strategically or for philosophical consistency, they would add in other tenets that destroyed sort of like what we would consider traditional social fabric or cohesion. Anti-marriage is a famous new left
yeah.
position. Drug use is a famous new left position. All this other stuff, of which the Weathermen and all the other groups we're going to be talking about belong to. Um, and they thought that this would liberate people and build momentum as more people got liberated, then they would spread the news and all this other stuff. Um, and in reality, most people were just fine with getting rid of marriage and taking drugs, and weren't really so fine with bombings and shootings.
Right, right. So here's how he exactly the way he puts it is America, it turned out, had fallen in love with everything about this groovy new counterculture, except its politics. Um, so those like Weathermen who had predicted a revolution in America ended up being half right. A revolution was arriving, but it was a cultural rather than a political phenomenon. So much of America wanted to dress like Bernardine Dorn, the a major figurehead of a major leader of the Weathermen, smoke pot like Bernardine Dorn and listen to Bernardine's music, the music she liked, but it honestly didn't want to hear a word she had to say. um, so as he says, as these new values seeped into the American mindset during 1970, 71, and 72, it turned out that what most Americans wanted to do was focus not on politics, and certainly not on overthrowing the government, but on themselves. Um, and I think this came as a little bit of a shock because reading about the '60s, Ryan, at least the Black radical, the civil rights movement, and everything, it feels like there's this momentum building for more and more radical action, and so it seems kind of strange in a way that you hit, late 1970, 71, and it just peters out into this hippie cultural, let's just get wasted kind of thing, Um, and
Right,
they
and
certainly
I
the ones who are really politically activated, like these folks, the ones who are really
mm,
steeped in Marxism, they did not see that coming because from their point of view, everything was getting more and more political because it was for them, right?
right, and there were two reasons I think, like, or one reason I gave last time, and one that might be good for explaining the historical significance of this. Um, people will go, the population, a group of people will usually go with the path of least resistance. So if you offer the youth of especially a modern generation, uh, you can pick anything of what we're offering, and we're offering you drugs, sex, copious amounts of alcohol, and overthrowing the government. Three of those things are getting rid of standards, making things easier for people to give into their urges, to have more fun, whatnot else. And one of those things is a very, very difficult thing that could involve losing your life. Um, most most population would not go for it, and especially not a modern one, and especially not the youth or the sort of younger types that these people were inevitably targeting. Um, and then the other thing is, to them, it was going to be a great surprise. But if now that we can look back on it, it's not so surprising it turned out this way. Just because there was a lot of interference with their plans by outside forces, like, say, the FBI,
Mm-hmm.
which
Right.
we'll get into later when we go on to the
Yeah.
next group. But the confusion operations aren't exactly a new thing.
Exactly. Right. So so what happened with the Weathermen? Well, for one thing, they renamed themselves. I'll explain that in a moment because it feels so familiar now. Their reason for renaming themselves. Um, they put out a communique, probably written by Bernardine Dorn, on December 6th, 1970, called New Morning. Right. So same as Bob Dylan's album. Um, And the tone of this was really not what you'd come to expect from these folks. It was a stark admission of their failure to draw others into revolutionary violence, but also how much the world had moved away from those tactics in just a year. It read, "It has been 9 months since the townhouse explosion. In that time, the future of our revolution has changed decisively, and the Weathermen need to change too." So they rejected almost everything that the Weathermen had represented up to the townhouse. They said, "The townhouse forever destroyed our belief that armed struggle is the only real revolutionary struggle." They acknowledged their military error and apologized not only for its technical inexperience, but for a tendency to consider only bombings or picking up the gun as revolutionary, with the glorification of the heavier, the better. They didn't say anything about supporting black revolutionaries, which had been a constant theme up to now. Bernardine Dorn changed the name of the group because Weatherman was sexist. Who knew? And they would now be called the Weather Underground. Who knew that little act there would be a precursor, a foreshadowing of, statues being torn down and, all the stuff we're going through now.
Yeah, I think that just proves more than anything we've been co-opted as a society by some sort of new left force, and probably not pure new left, but
Yeah.
we've definitely haven't got much other influence than them.
It tastes similar, doesn't it? Somehow. The Panther trial was going on. This was a group of New York Panthers who had been planning to do a big action. Turned out that two of the people involved in the conspiracy were FBI agents, and so they all ended up on trial. The Panther 21, it became a real cause célèbre. We'll come back to that in a bit. Anyway, so that was actually going on, and the Panther 21 actually issued an open letter criticizing the Weather's communique, because the Weathermen, or Weather Underground now, was retreating from revolutionary violence. It says this open letter from the jailed Panthers put the Weather's leadership in a delicate position. Everyone knew what many Panthers wanted to do: kill policemen. And this is the strategy that Weather had now disavowed. And so now they had to make a choice. Do they, say, yes, we have rejected that avenue, or, that avenue of violence, or no, you're right, we're going back to being radically violent. And they just didn't respond. The Weather just decided to be silent. And this was actually a critical moment. It says, one radical attorney of the period said, "That right there is the moment when they abandoned the blacks, abandoned everything they ever said about helping the blacks, and we all knew it. Bernadine, Billy, that pretty boy Jeff Jones, all of them, they decided they didn't want to die, they didn't want to go to jail. So they walked out on everything they believed so they could stay free and stay alive." So that fits very nicely into what you were just saying, Ryan, right? Not only was this the choice of, a lot of young, sort of vaguely lefty hippie people at the time, it was literally the choice of the Weather Underground itself. They decided to turn away from, they didn't want to die, right? They were not ready to be soldiers in this war and possibly die for it. Having said that, they didn't completely stop. On March 1st, 1971, they blew up the Capitol. Did you know that? Pretty much all the leadership took part. Bernardine Dorn, Kathy Buden left a bomb behind a toilet in the first floor men's room on the Senate side of the building. Yes, we're talking about the Capitol that you may have heard never had anything happen to it until January 6th.
The greatest threat to our democracy happened in my lifetime, Stephen. I think that this might be historical inaccuracy, that there is something like a bombing in the Capitol.
I know, because you'd think they would have mentioned it, right?
Yeah, I for one can't believe that our media overlords would expunge this from the record.
Right. So it says that the bomb didn't go off, so they had to go back and rearm it, send a second team back in to sneak back, rearm it. There was like no security at this point back in those days. This all changed because of this bombing, by the way. And then the bomb finally detonated at 1:30 in the morning, demolishing the restroom, heavily damaging an adjacent barber shop, and blowing out windows in a Senate dining room down a corridor. Damage was estimated at $300,000 in 1970 dollars, which I thought I came up with that last week. It's like, I don't know, over $1 million these days, or maybe more like two.
Yeah.
Inflation adjusted, On ABC News, anchorman Howard K. Smith noted that it was the first attack on the Capitol since the British burned it in 1814. So there you go. And then it was forgotten because that's how they do things. Okay, and then
because it doesn't fit a narrative, and so you will never hear about it again because the left isn't the one that is terroristic and causes violence. It is the right. So whenever you see violence from the left, it can't be because the left does not cause violence. That's how the narrative works.
right.
You will never see this in a school book so long as this regime stands.
Yep. And then they were almost captured a few days after that. They almost captured Bernardine Dorn and Jeff Jones on March 5th. Just around that time. And then on March 5th, they had a 1-year anniversary of the townhouse, and Abby Hoffman was there and paying tribute to Terry, Teddy, and Diana, who got killed in that bombing. And that was the end of the Weather Underground for a little while. But this brings us to the next part of our story. It says, barely 60 days later, on the other side of Manhattan, something new began. And now we turn to the Black Liberation Army. I'm going to start with a quote from Joanne Chesimard, aka Assata Shakur. She says, the idea of a Black Liberation Army emerged from conditions in Black communities, conditions of poverty, indecent housing, massive unemployment, poor medical care, and inferior education. The idea came about because Black people are not free or equal in this country, because 90% of the men and women in this country's prisons are Black and third world. Hey, isn't that like a BIPOC, right? They don't use that phrase so much in America, but in the UK they use BIPOC, I think. It means Black, Indigenous, people of color. Anyway, similar idea, all the oppressed people. All the non-white people, frankly. But anyway, because 10-year-old children are shot down in our streets, because dope has saturated our communities, preying on the disillusionment and frustration of our children. The concept of the BLA arose because of the political, social, and economic oppression of Black people in this country. And where there is oppression, there will be resistance. The BLA is part of that resistance movement. The Black Liberation Army stands for freedom and justice for all people. Anyway, sorry, I can't say that last part with a straight face because let me tell you what happened. So, May 1971, they shoot 2 policemen, officers, sorry, you have this ready? Thomas Curry and Nicholas Benetti. I think those 2 survived, as I recall. And then, let's see, 2 days later, I think, this happened. And this I'm going to read a little bit in detail. And, I meant to warn at the beginning. This gets gruesome. 2 nights after that first shooting I mentioned, Waverly Jones and Joseph Piagentini walked into Colonial Park to answer a call about a woman hurt in a knife fight. Then they went back to their car and they passed 2 young Black men lounging against the fender of a parked car. The men fell in behind them. A moment later, the men drew pistols and opened fire. Okay, you've got your warning. Here we go. Officer Jones, who was Black, was struck 3 times, first in the back of the head, then twice in the spine. He died instantly. The second gunman fired repeatedly into Officer Piagentini, who fell to the sidewalk, but as the gunman cursed him, refused to die. The first gunman then reached down and removed Officer Jones' .38, hefting it in his hand, feeling its weight as if he were taking a souvenir. The second gunman wrenched Piagentini's weapon from its holster, even as the dying officer flailed at him. Once he had it, he fired every bullet in its chamber into the fallen cop. Still, Piagentini wouldn't die. The first gunman stepped to his prone body, pointed his own 45 downward, and fired a single shot. Then both shooters turned and walked away. Behind them, Officer Piagentini, in his last moments of life, began crawling toward the safety of a green hedge, a trail of blood in his wake. The next morning, the coroner would count 22 bullet holes in his body. Um, so let me tell.
if
Oh,
this were in
I was going to
a,
read their communiques about it, but go ahead.
I was just gonna say if this was in a British context or something like that, just with a it's a shorter time frame we're dealing with here, but the amount of violence and the sort of viciousness of it and the suddenness of it in civilian settings might be akin to something you might see out of the Troubles, not a direct one-to-one or analogy,
Right.
but this is kind of what we're dealing with here.
Yep. Right. Exactly. Um, and these were not just, you know, glory killings or whatever. They had a political purpose, and that's why they belong in this series on left wing terror, right? On about terrorism. Um, two packages were delivered that same evening. One to the New York Times, the second to a Harlem radio station, WLIB. Each carried a license plate, the same plate seen on the Maverick, whose occupants shot officers Curry and Benetti, the first two officers. The Times package also contained a 45 caliber cartridge and a typewritten message, and this is what it read. So this is May 19th after the first two officers were shot. May 19th, 1971. All power to the people. Here are the license plates sought after by the fascist state pig police. We send them in order to exhibit the potential power of oppressed peoples to acquire revolutionary justice. The armed goons of this racist government will again meet the guns of oppressed third world people as long as they occupy our community and murder our brothers and sisters in the name of American law and order. Just as the fascist Marines and Army occupy Vietnam in the name of democracy and murder Vietnamese people in the name of American imperialism, are confronted with the guns of the Vietnamese Liberation Army. The domestic armed forces of racism and oppression will be confronted with the guns of the Black Liberation Army, who will mete out in the tradition of Malcolm and all true revolutionaries real justice. We are revolutionary justice, all power to the people. Then, 3 nights later, a second pair of packages arrived at that Harlem radio station. And this time, a somewhat shorter letter read this: Revolutionary justice has been meted out again by righteous brothers of the Black Liberation Army with the death of 2 Gestapo pigs gunned down as so many of our brothers have been gunned down in the past. But this time, no racist jury will acquit them. Revolutionary justice is ours. Every policeman, lackey, or running dog of the ruling class must make his or her choice now. Either side with the people, poor and oppressed, or die for the oppressor. Trying to stop what is going down is like trying to stop history. For as long as there are those who will dare live for freedom, there are men and women who dare to unhorse the emperor. All power to the people. And so the detectives confirmed that both letters came from the same typewriter. And they read these 2 notes and they asked, what the hell was the Black Liberation Army? Because this is how they came on the scene in May 1971.
And 2 quick notes about the letters here. One, the rhetoric should sound very familiar because it's basically the rhetoric that you would have seen coming out of, say, uh, at least some of it is the rhetoric that you would see coming out of the Obama campaign. You can't stop history, so you might as well go along with us. That we will always keep fighting for what is right and all this other stuff. That's the generic part. And then you get the other sort of references. The biggest evil that you could tell from these communications is the Nazis.
Right, the
2 Gestapo pigs.
Gestapo pigs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, that's why whenever I hear people that claim to be, say, right wing or conservatives or traditionalists saying that the Nazis are the worst thing to ever happen, either in their rhetoric or directly, um, I'm kind of skeptical as to whether or not they are conservative or traditional or right wing. Just given by the fact that they have accepted a very new left ideal, which is Nazism is the ultimate evil. And then the funny thing is in that first communique, the first message, their ever precious cudgel, the accusation of racism, was
Yeah.
misspelled.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It is.
You would think their powerful weapon, it would have more respect attached to it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a few misspellings, and that's one of them. Um, so it's interesting because he says that actually that question, what is the Black Liberation Army? It's still being asked to some degree because those who look at this, and he says it's not covered very well. Black Liberation Army is not a topic that's been covered well by scholars or anything. Is partially because it was always sort of unclear whether the BLA was the sort of organized terrorist force that the Weather Underground was, for example. So his Burroughs' editorial comment here is he says, to the press at least, poorly educated, self-proclaimed black guerrillas who murdered policemen were not credible revolutionaries, but self-proclaimed white guerrillas from good schools who bombed vacant buildings were. And there he's referring to a difference here between who is doing these things and their background. As I already mentioned, the Weathermen, the Weather Underground, primarily Jewish, primarily middle class, primarily from good colleges often, like University of Chicago. Bernardine Dorn was at University of Chicago when my good friend Charles Ford was. I think they started in the same year, something like that. And what we'll see here is that the Black Liberation Army was not drawing from that same set of people. They were, I think, all black, if I remember correctly. I don't think there was any non-black involved with the Black Liberation Army. They were all black. They were not generally from college. There's one exception. Well, the lady I quoted, actually, she was the one who had been at college, Asada Shakur, if I remember correctly. But most of them were not. Most of them were ex-cons. They had been in prison for some time. They got radicalized in prison by Malcolm X, by Nation of Islam type stuff, and they came out ready to be politically active, to take action. But somehow they never got any respect. Now, that's not quite fair though, because the Black Liberation Army was pretty good at being keeping their lips closed. Partially because a lot of them ended up getting killed, but partially also because they were better at what is it called, muerta or whatever, with the mafia. They were better with the code of silence.
And if you look at why or what the Black Liberation Army came out of, what the occasion was for their creation, which we'll get into, it'll make sense why they were so quiet, because they were a very paranoid group.
Yeah, right. So, where did the Black Liberation Army come from? It came from the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party had a split, and the BLA was a splinter group off of the Black Panther Party, just as the Weathermen were a split off from SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. And he says, so in one sense, that's what the BLA was. But in another sense, it was the logical culmination of the Black Power movement, which really got rolling with Eldridge Cleaver splintering off from the civil rights movement, rejecting Martin Luther King's nonviolent approach, and saying, no, we've got to have a violent revolution. After years of black revolutionaries calling for armed attacks against the police and federal government, one group, the BLA, finally actually did it, as we just heard in gruesome detail. So the BLA emerged during the Black Panther Party's implosion in the spring of 1971. And it's basically several chapters seceded from the party. But the key one really was New York. And the story of the BLA is basically the story of the New York Black Panthers. They were a different set, as we'll see. So two people he highlights, for example, that were key from the New York chapter were Nathaniel Burns and Anthony Costin. Burns became later known as Sekou Odinga, and he would emerge as the most admired revolutionary of his age, a savvy urban guerrilla who traveled the globe, robbed banks, and engineered prison breakouts during an underground career spanning 12 years. Some of that goes beyond what we're going to cover today. Sekou Odinga, I think. Remember that name. Costin was became known as Lumumba Shakur, and his career was not so long. Um, they were both in prison, I think, right? Or was it just one? Give me a sec. Yeah, they were both at
They
Comstock. Go ahead.
Yeah, and well, yeah, they were both in prison, and they both knew each other throughout multiple times in their life.
Right.
And now people on the right get accused of LARPing quite a lot. But I don't think that we've had anyone change their names from a very, American Anglo name to Sekou Odinga or Lumumba Shakur.
Right.
Uh, I feel like once again this might be projection from vestiges left over from the New Left. Uh, you're the LARPers, not us.
Yeah, right, right. So they renewed their friendship inside at the Comstock, New York prison, and they were both in the process of discovering the teachings of Malcolm X. But the big surprise was that Shakur's father was way ahead of them. Um, he says, in the summer of 1962, my father came to see me. He was telling me about the family, but he seemed reluctant about something. Then he dropped it on me, and it blew my mind because I was thinking about how I was going to say the same thing to him. He asked me my opinion of Brother Malcolm X. I told my father that, quote, Malcolm X is a very beautiful brother, and all the brothers in prison love Brother Malcolm X. I also told my father that I was a black nationalist and a Muslim, and his father showed complete satisfaction, and they talked for hours. And that elder, Costin, Lumumba Shakur's father, came to be known as Abba Shakur, and he acted as a spiritual guide for his son and his friends, and a role he continued for many in the Black Panthers and the BLA.
No,
Yeah,
there was a section in there that you left out, and this is kind of why I was skeptical as to adopting Islam being a heartfelt or religious thing and more of a political thing. It's because he admits himself he could not relate to praying,
right. Yeah,
which basically just tells me that this is being adopted because it has utility, not because they think it is the truth.
right, right. It's not a big religious moment. Yeah, it's part of
Yeah.
the package of adopting radicalism, right? Okay, so one of the so what happened is that these two and some others like them became, after they got out of prison, became part of the New York chapter of the Black Panther Party, and that caused problems. From the beginning, the Panther leadership, which was in California, Huey Newton being the key guy there, right? They were ill at ease with the New York recruits. Many of the New Yorkers, steeped in Malcolm X's teachings, had risen from gangs and served in prison. They were far more streetwise, confrontational, and Afrocentric than the Californians, and we'll see that affected how they dressed, the names they adopted, and so forth. Let's see. Yeah, from the beginning, Odinga and Shakur had a secret agenda, the same one later pursued by the Black Liberation Army. They wanted to kill cops. So let's see. And here we have to do a little rabbit hole because, as you may or may not know, Ryan has an interest in music, a multifaceted interest in music. So let me just read this and then I'll let you go on this.
Okay.
So he says the legal odyssey of Lumumba. Oh, so Lumumba Shakur, sorry, was got arrested as part of the Panther 21. Two of the Panthers turned out to be police detectives. I said FBI, sorry. Turned out to be police detectives, and the New York PD swooped in and arrested almost everyone, including Lumumba Shakur. And then there's this dramatic story of how Sekou Odinga avoided arrest by basically jumping off a roof. But he survived it. So the legal odyssey of Lumumba Shakur and the rest of Panther 21 falls outside the narrative of this book. All told, their mass trial lasted more than 8 months, from September 1970 to May 1971. At the time, it was the longest and most expensive trial in New York history. The 21 became a cause célèbre for the city's white radicals, as well as many wealthy liberals. The legendary Park Avenue party, thrown by the composer Leonard Bernstein, which inspired writer Tom Wolfe to coin the term radical chic, was a fundraiser for the 21. Celebrities adored the New York Panthers. When Shakur's slender intellectual brother Zaid was arrested, his bail was posted by none other than Jane Fonda. Zaid Shakur, so slight his peers jokingly called him the field mouse rather than field marshal, would go on to become an influential member of the BLA. So, Leonard Bernstein, what in the heck is he doing mixed up with violent black radicals? Help us, Ryan.
Right. So
Wasn't he?
I'm not going
Wasn't
to
he
say.
a famous, well-respected classical music composer or something, or conductor?
I mean, well respected, I don't think is even claimed by many people today.
Oh,
Most people would say he was talented, sure, but not many people like him, from what I can gather. Maybe some in sort of like the very, very mainstream. Um, there's a couple of things here. Most of the classical music that you'll find on YouTube or you'll find broadcasted in commercials or whatnot else are recordings from two individuals: von Karajan, who was basically the German or the Berlin orchestral leader from basically the rise of the NSDAP to must have been like the 80s. And then Leonard Bernstein, who's famous for musical plays like West Side Story uh, and shows and movies, as well as just recordings of classical music. There's a very marked difference between the two. Our very good German friend was known for being trying to be very true to the intentions of what was written down on the page and the intentions of the composer, who carried on basically an oral tradition that he had to write down from the people that taught him. Very sort of traditionalist. He was called fascistic until he finally died because of how strict he was. And then we had Leonard Bernstein, who was the sort of American confutation to the more strict, older style of Karajan. Leonard Bernstein would be the figurehead of this. He was very liberal. Most people that were around him, if I remember correctly, described him as being sort of unpleasant, which is how a lot of these major liberal figures go in this point in time. Very reminiscent of people writing about Lyndon B. Johnson. Um, not a pleasant guy to be around, but he made very good music and he usually delivered a good product. He was very popular on Broadway productions, whatnot else. He had all the moments of prestige. He was also a very, very accomplished socialite. So when the Black Panther becomes a topic of sort of intellectual play among these liberal elite types, he hops onto it thinking that he can be one, a good person in his view. Two, he can garner popularity, and three, he can kind of uh, put himself in the limelight, which is what his music is very reminiscent of. He's a rather egotistical conductor. He'll take things very quickly just because he can. It's his orchestra and all this other stuff. Sort of taking the beauty out of music and making it a performance, which is modern American music culture. Um, but with this, um, he hosts a party around a very, very violent group of black radicals, who not even all of the blacks were very favorable of, if I remember correctly. Um, oh, who was the I'm blanking on, the black jazz trumpeter. I wanna say Davis, uh,
Miles Davis.
Miles Davis, yeah. So,
Yeah.
I believe he, wrote basically a, response to this or a, satirization or something like that. You'd have to ask Mr. D for this because he read it out to a group of friends one time, and it was absolutely hilarious to go through. Everyone, this did nothing for Bernstein's image. It made himself look like a fool even before the bad stuff will hit that we'll get into in a second. And he was basically called a champagne socialist who was doing this as like a as entertainment. Basically, it's um, I've had to play his music,
So wait,
his
wait. So
arrange.
you're saying he probably did it, one suspects, to get like increased social capital, and it kind of blew up in his
Yeah,
face, is what you're saying.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Not even like the group he was playing towards was like thought it was a great thing.
Mm.
They were split. There were some that just didn't like the Black Panthers or violence, and then there were some that thought this was all just a play or a show.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, And after having played Bernstein's music and listening to his recordings, comparing them to the competition and whatnot else, um, I'm very happy that this happened to him, given that he is inalterably influenced music recording.
Now you understand probably what Mr. D was reading you was not from Miles Davis, but from Tom Wolfe. He talks about coining the term radical chic. He actually wrote about that party, as I recall. There's a piece by Tom Wolfe about that party,
Okay, right.
which I think Tom Wolfe was in attendance at it, and he
Yeah,
just thought it was such a joke, so he really made fun of it.
yeah. In my defense, it probably was Wolf. We were talking about Davis later in that evening, so
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, disregard what I said earlier.
Right. Okay. Anything else you wanted to say about Bernstein? I thought you were talking
No,
about
I think
what
that
happened later for
yeah,
him.
yeah. And so like it blew up in his face almost immediately. But
Mm-hmm.
there's more that's coming. Like this is a it's really funny. It's almost like a slapstick comedy, except social instead of physical. So
Wait, more that's
it's
coming
going
in
to
in the book, in the story we're
yeah
going through. Oh,
because he hosted a party for these groups of people before the BLA kind of established itself, if I remember
right.
correctly,
Yeah.
as and some of those people that he was raising money for would end up being in that group, and it would be publicized, um, which of course would mean
Oh.
all of these sort of liberal causes surrounding them would basically just make them look like god-hating communists. They're funding racial terrorists in New York City. Look at these guys is kind of what it would look like
Okay, I
eventually.
see. So right. I'm sorry. There's a part I skipped, and I guess I should stick it back in. So Tom Wolfe. Or I'm sorry. Right. So the most prominent Panther in attendance at Bernstein's party, and the centerpiece of Wolfe's article, was Field Marshal Don Cox, who, while little remembered today, would go on to become a guiding force behind the Black Liberation Alliance. Um, and so that is um, him directly hosting Black Liberation Army. Sorry, Black Liberation Army. So that was him hosting a guy who basically was seconds later going to be a terrorist, basically, right? Or maybe was at the
Yeah,
time. I
and
don't know.
yeah,
I don't know
and
when the
not
party
just
was.
him. There were connections for multiple others. It's just that the Don Cox was the most directly involved, and he's not remembered today, as the
Mhm.
book says. But it was known that most of these people, especially as time went on and more got publicized in trials and investigations and whatnot else, these people were very violent, and it wasn't like their rhetoric wasn't 100% we're fighting oppression. It was half the time we hate white people and they should die. Which, whenever you have sort of liberal elites trying to host a party because they just want to get help the oppressed, and the people that they raised money for goes out the next day and says, we want to shoot as many cops as possible, uh, kind of looks like maybe the John Birchers had a point somewhere along the way,
Oh yeah,
is
right,
kind of what it's going to look like to the average American.
right. Um, so I'm going to try to avoid going down this particular rabbit hole, but he does cover Eldridge Cleaver. As I mentioned, Eldridge Cleaver had been a key civil rights leader, but then had a real split from MLK because Eldridge Cleaver wanted to be more radical, and he was more of a firebrand. But he eventually had to leave. Let's see what happened. Um, he ended up, oh yeah, he fled a court date in November 1968. He went to Cuba, and then Fidel Castro gave him the cold shoulder, so that he ended up going to Algiers in 1969, the summer I was born. And Algiers was the perfect place and the perfect moment for Eldridge Cleaver. Um, Algiers had won its bloody war for independence from France in 1962. There's a very essential documentary about that war. Do you know about it, Ryan? The Battle of Algiers.
Well,
Battle of Algiers. That's what it is.
okay, yeah.
Yeah, the Battle of Algiers is something everyone should watch, in my view. Very interesting. Um,
The
anyway,
thing that I would add about the Algeria thing is it's
Yeah.
hilarious, because you and I will oftentimes criticize U.S. foreign policy. One of the things we'll say is, the interventions that we cause, the regimes that we prep up, usually will come back to hurt Americans. Um, Algeria, and its sort of post-colonial conflicts that happened, got support, if I remember correctly, from the USSR and from elements in the United States,
Mm.
just because the United States had a habit of undermining its Cold War allies in the effort to decolonize.
Mm-hmm.
France quite famously tried to hold on to Algeria, and then when the government looked like it was starting to relent, there was a secret army organization that was a very that would make a good novel. It was a
Yeah.
secret society of army officers that wanted to make sure that Algeria remained French. Um, that didn't look good in the Cold War when you have one side saying that it's fighting for freedom, the other side, the communists, are going to say, but you have colonies that don't have voting rights and all this other stuff, self determination that you tried to push on the world after World War One. What's going on
Right.
there? So the U.S., especially under Eisenhower and the later Democratic and Republican presidents, just kind of accepted the Soviet framing there and started pushing decolonization movements, and one of which was sort of undermining France in that Algerian war. If I remember correctly, as well, like other American interventions, we had sides supporting France, so it wasn't all unified.
Yeah.
But our foreign policy was very anti-colonial.
Right.
And what's happening here? Well, this post-colonial nation isn't going to join the bloc that had previously ruled it. It's going to join the Soviet bloc, and so Algeria, if I remember correctly, while nominally being somewhat neutral or whatever else, basically just acted as the go-between for communist
Yeah.
organizations, societies, liberation armies, movements,
Exactly.
and the Western Bloc that tried to censor them. So, great job with the American foreign policy. The anti-colonialism is really paying off. We have Black
Right.
Panthers in Algeria now.
Right. Exactly. Yes. It says that since winning their independence in 62, the Algerian government had forged close relations with the Soviet Union and allowed scores of revolutionary groups from Angola to Palestine to maintain offices in its diplomatic community. A London paper termed Algiers in 1969 the headquarters of world revolution. So, yeah, great. So, he Cleaver figured he could demand an embassy there as well. It took a while for that to happen, for about a year for the government to approve official recognition of the international section of the Black Panther Party, which Eldridge Cleaver considered himself the head of. Now, all this may sound kind of like crazy and grand, but remember what Ryan was just saying. There's decolonization stuff going on at this time. And so blacks in America are seeing their fight as tied in with Africans who are getting out from under European colonialism, right? And so they're seeing themselves as somehow all allied together. It's unclear to me, Ryan, how much any of this African and African American alliance actually resulted in anything, in anyone really helping anyone else beyond Eldridge
Well,
Cleaver getting to camp out in Algiers for a couple of years.
yeah, yeah. I was about to say Eldridge Cleaver got a nice, periodical stipend with a fancy hotel and all of his other stuff. So,
Right.
you know, there is that alliance there, I suppose, if you could call it that.
Yeah. So didn't get much from that. There was a big conflict. This led to this split, I think. Big conflict between Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver. And they had a very intense rivalry, and it was stoked by the COINTELPRO program of the FBI. So they forged letters between various Panthers passing on allegations that Newton was plotting to kill Cleaver and vice versa. Now, why is that all important? It's because the New York members wanted to side with Cleaver, and the rest of them, there was a big public split between Cleaver and Newton. And basically everybody went with Huey Newton in America except for the New York chapter. Or most of its members wanted to side with Cleaver because they were more radical. They wanted to be more radical.
Right, and
And
we were
so,
describing earlier, they were more Afrocentric in New York, so they were in complete break with the rest of the Black Panther Party. They were
right,
renaming themselves to more authentic African names. They were wearing what's the hat called?
dashikis. Well, dashikis is a shirt,
Yeah,
but yeah,
sorry, yeah.
dashikis and
Um,
yeah. As
so
opposed to, you picture the Black Panthers like on the thumbnail, you see the leather jackets. But these guys started to wear dashikis and go in that direction, lean into
right,
the
and then
Afrocentric direction.
yeah, and then our good friend Semiagog can sometimes get flack, sometimes even from me, for thinking everything and everyone is the Fed. But here you have the FBI forging documents that were never said by any real person in a
Right.
time before the internet that has completely split up a threat to the regime. This one violent. I don't think
Hmm.
Semiagog is affiliated with anything violent, but there's undoubtedly still federal interference, especially with the thousands and thousands of communications channels today,
Right.
among groups that could be seen as threatening to the regime, peaceful or violent.
Right. Oliver's saying is everyone is a Fed. Um, just to take that as your starting assumption. Um, okay, so so the reason why all that backstory is important is because that's how the BLA started. They had sent some people from the West Coast to get these New York people in line, and one of them, a guy named Robert Webb, ended up really getting on with the New York radicals, the Eldridge Cleaver style Black Panthers in New York. And they liked him. They called him Coffee Man, and they adopted him. They said, Coffee Man saw how we worked. He hooked up with us. He became one of us, and that made the powers that be very, very nervous. And then one day, Webb confronted a rival Panther selling newspapers, because now there was this sort of open conflict between the two branches of the Black Panthers. Um, and we don't really know what went down, but somehow Webb ended up dead on the sidewalk, single bullet hole in the back of his head. And the Harlem Panthers claimed he had been killed by an assassin, by a Huey Newton assassin. Um, and then J. Edgar Hoover took credit with the COINTELPRO activities with causing Webb's murder. So it was Huey Newton or the FBI or just two guys got in an argument, one ended up dead, and it had big implications. And so Webb's death electrified the New York Panthers, who were convinced that the long-awaited war had begun. And that's when the BLA started, according to a former BLA member or former Black Panther. Certain people were told to go underground. He says, who made the decisions? I wish I knew. To this day, I don't really know. But they did what the weather men had decided to do, right? Go underground so that they can take action and hide their identities and so forth, and their location. And okay, yeah, cautionary note. I sort of said this, but let me be really explicit here. This book is amazing. He covers stuff in Days of Rage that had not been well covered ever. In some cases, summarizing, writings that and interviews that were already available. In a chapter like this, he's breaking a lot of new ground. He's talking to people who had not talked for decades. He really gave us a piece of history that was getting completely lost. So we owe a lot of credit to the author here. He said, but caution in this section of the Black Liberation Army, the full story of the BLA's origins will probably never be told. Too many people have died then and since. Too many who lived still worry about being prosecuted for the killings that began that chaotic spring. One man who will talk, however, was perhaps the BLA's most important organizer. His name was, in 1971, was Richard Dhoruba Moore. 40 years later, he is known as Dhoruba bin Wahab, but we'll call him Dhoruba Moore. And he was 26 that spring of 1971. So let's see. So Dhoruba went to New York. He began gathering his people. And they were basically men and a few women with arms or medical training whom Dhoruba felt he could trust. They mostly came from 3 neighborhoods, including the Brownsville section of Brooklyn. where he had worked, and South Jamaica, which is a section of I met a lady from Jamaica on a flight. Jamaica is a section of New York City, uh, and that was the home of many of the heaviest Panthers, including the Shakur brothers and Sekua Dinga. And then the Washington Heights chapter of the National Committee to Combat Fascism, a Panther affiliated group. So that's where these people are coming from. And there was a cell that coalesced around Deruba Moore, but there were other cells. They did not act in from a top-down kind of a way. The cells acted independently of each other. It's estimated that about 50 to 80 Panthers were in some stage of going underground, but it was Deruba Moore's that was the first to act. Let's see. So what did they do? Quick note, the group's medical expert, she knew first aid at least, was Joanne Chesimard, later known as Asada Shakur, a smart, attractive City College student who would eventually become the BLA's most infamous member. So what they did actually to begin with was they needed to have money for food and rent, and so they started holding up heroin dealers, drug dealers, because part of, if you know anything about Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, they actually had something that you could say was positive, I guess. They had conservative values of a certain sort. They were not hippies. They were oriented towards family, community, support Black businesses, all that kind of stuff. And they saw drugs as a hostile, attack on their communities. And so they figured if you were in the drug trade, even if you were Black, you were a fair target. And so it was a twofer for them to target the drug dealers. They needed the resources, they needed the money they could get from holding these guys up, and they didn't like the drugs being dealt with in their community. So they started taking down heroin dealers and taking their money. Let's see. Yeah, so wow, I won't share that, but there was a terrible killing of one of the Black Panther guy in one of the Black Panther offices. Now this maybe gets to what you were talking about, Ryan, in terms of the fallout for the white radicals. It says to those, this guy got killed in a horrible, tortured and killed, and then set on fire. And it says to those white radicals who had rallied to the Panther 21's defense, the sudden outbreak of violence was deeply unsettling. Yeah, it's weird, right? Because it's like they're liking the radical chic, as Tom Wolfe put it, of being associated with edgy violence. But when the violence really happens, then they're like, whoa, we just liked you talking about it. We didn't want you to actually do it.
Yeah, you're only supposed to say it. You're not supposed to actually pull the trigger. That's when it stops being fun and cool and an art style and a statement and starts being revolutionary or something like that, which especially New York liberals do not like.
So then, let's see, about a month later, they ambushed 4 police officers, killing 2. And that's what we started with. There's some detail there about why they attacked those officers. It was because of something the police, they viewed it as a backlash for something that police had done. Let's see. Oh yeah, and then they announced, remember it was May 19th where they put that first communique out after attacking those first 2 officers. That is not a coincidence, or that is not a random date. That was Malcolm X's birthday, May 19th. So that's why they chose that, to attack the officers and get that communique out. Let's see, and then all Deruba will say, though he says, gives him a lot of information, he won't talk about some things. He says all he will say today is that he regrets targeting patrolmen. The tactical mistake we made was killing the cops in uniform, he says, when we should have killed the higher ups. That would have been more effective. So then here's a really important thing. They're starting to go underground. They're starting to take action. and Eldridge Cleaver is really the one who they look to as their leader. And it says when the Panther split in February, with the Panther split in February 1971, Cleaver's dreams seemed to be coming true. After years of calling for guerrilla warfare in the United States, militant Panthers began flocking to New York to take arms. Policemen were murdered. Communiques were issued. Given his role as a beacon of revolutionary violence, one might have expected Cleaver to anoint himself chairman of the BLA. He didn't. In fact, Cleaver ordained that the BLA would have no leader, not him, not anyone. The guidelines that Cleaver and Don Cox, the guy who had been at that Bernstein party, what they laid down is that the structure would be the exact opposite of the Weather Underground. The Weather cadres did nothing without direction from the leadership. They wanted the BLA units to operate independently with no central coordination whatsoever. And one of the BLA members says, "I never understood the concept of an organization without leadership." Anyway, we could go down a whole tangent on elite theory, but
Yeah.
he says, I always thought that was going to be difficult, and it was. When we got into the field, we were supposed to be autonomous, and you'd be 2 or 3 cells trying to do their own thing. I remember once 2 cells showed up to rob the same bank. So he said not having leadership, that was a problem. But it did have some benefits from their point of view, the decentralized structure. It distanced Cleaver from BLA violence because the Algerian government did not condone acts of violence initiated on its own soil. So Cleaver was going to lose his perch in Algeria if he was seen as, issuing hits from Algeria, right? Go ahead.
Right, and if he was issuing hits from Algeria, his lifespan was probably going to decrease exponentially as time went on. The U.S. government has a history of finding people on foreign soil that is might be seen as a leader of attacks against it.
Yeah, right.
It was doing this back in the Cold War. That's not just a post 2001 thing.
Yeah, right.
This
Assassinating
is
people.
probably if I had to bet, I would guess this is probably him ensuring himself that he wouldn't be immediately assassinated by a CIA operative.
Right. So this did get attention, these horrible attacks. The assassination of 2 New York police officers and the critical wounding of 2 more was so jarring that its reverberations were felt all the way to the White House, where on May 26th, 5 days after the shootings, Nixon summoned J. Edgar Hoover and Attorney General John Mitchell to the Oval Office. Was this the beginning, Nixon wondered, of the violent black uprising they had always feared? Or just Hoover didn't know, because these guys, kind of sprang up from nowhere. They didn't know what the Black Liberation Army was. Nixon told him to use every means necessary to stamp out the Black Liberation Army, or whatever it was. And there's a whole subplot about the FBI here, which is that I'm going to not go into great detail on it, but basically the FBI broke some rules in the process of trying to stop the BLA, and that came out later and actually was a big problem for
Many
the
such
FBI.
cases with J. Edgar Hoover was notorious for this, just because that was basically like his section of the government by this point in time.
Yeah, no, but it wasn't Hoover. They did it.
Right, but
they didn't do it under his orders. They did
department.
it. Yeah, that's right. Right. So then, let's see what happened here. They did have a success. The NYPD, of course, this had happened there, and they spread a dragnet out. I'm sorry, how did they get put onto them? Anyway, they put a dragnet out, and Druba Moore. They're doing more of their raids on clubs and heroin dealers, social clubs and heroin dealers and stuff like that. And while they're in the middle of this, I know, they just got lucky. That's what happened. The police got lucky. He fired some bullets into a wall over a man's head because the guy was not stripping fast enough because they wanted to take their jewelry and stuff. And police just happened to go by go by and hear it. So they radioed for backup. Bunch of police car pulled up, and they went in, and everybody was like, "Hey, nothing's going on inside there." They're all putting on their clothes, what's going on? And they're like, "Oh, we're just minding our own business." Um, and then the man who had drawn Daruba's fire, the man whose Daruba fired above his head, said, "No way, that's him," and pointed to Daruba. He was trying to just blend in, hoping that he wouldn't be given away. And he pointed to everybody. And so Daruba and his men were led away in handcuffs. Um, and they thought that that was it. With arresting this cell, they thought they had stuffed the BLA, but that's not correct.
Right. And
Okay,
the
go
note
ahead.
there about Nixon, that's
Yeah, yeah.
not just random or because he was the president or something. He was seen as like enemy number one of the sort of these black militants,
Hmm.
to the where they would start describing him and his actions as Nixon's going to put black people in camps and all this other stuff. Um, and it kind of makes sense from their perspective why they would really hate Nixon, because in 1960 you had the Kennedy presidency, which really pushed for civil rights. You had the Lyndon B. Johnson presidency that immediately followed, pushed for voting rights and civil rights, economic redistribution, all this other stuff.
It didn't just
And then
push
in
for them. Under
1968,
LBJ, a bunch of legislation was passed.
well, yeah, and so same
Right.
with Kennedy and all this other stuff. Like, but from the Black Panthers and the Black militants and all this other stuff, it doesn't necessarily matter if they did it. Um, of course, they would get annoyed if they didn't see things happening fast enough. It just mattered that they had someone that they thought was working for them in their office, not like friendly, but helping them in some manner. And then in 1968, you had an election where it looked like for a time Hubert Humphrey, the man responsible in the Senate for getting the Civil Rights Act of '64 passed,
Mm,
quite famously relying on liberal on liberal Republicans. He was the Democratic nominee, defeated by Richard Nixon, who,
mm,
from the perspective of the left, was bowing down to the evil segregationists under George Wallace and all this other stuff, which is um, we on my channel, I could probably give a real history of what happened there, but this is Nixon's like the evilest person to ever come across the
right.
sort of black militants and sympathetic movements, just because he stopped what was looking like a sort of like a three president chain of ever
Mm,
more radical civil rights, voting rights, economic integration legislation that he kind of signals a point in time where most of the country realizes that that's the past news cycle, and now we're on to different things like, say, the Vietnam War.
mm-hmm. Right. And Nixon, I think you explained that he was not enforcing the some of the desegregation measures and stuff, right?
Yeah, in some cases he let up on on federal enforcement, and that's the thing. If you don't have the votes to repeal legislation, while you're in office, you can just not enforce it if
Right.
you're the executive.
Right. Right. So here's a poem that appeared in Eldridge Cleaver's Right On Black Community News Service in fall 1971, which is the period we're heading into here. Faceless brothers of the night who swim through the city like fish in the sea, never resting in your search and destroy mission against the system. I know how lonely you are, and my heart reaches out to you. As repression grows, it becomes more difficult for us to continue our struggle here, but we persist until the final day when we shall join you in the sea of blood that will flow in the streets of Babylon. All right. So, let's see. Wanted to talk about. So this period we're going into is June 1971 and February 1972. I keep saying this, but this was all like when I was a baby. I was born in summer 1969, and I'm just amazed that I wasn't more aware. Um, my family, my father's was very interested in politics. He campaigned for Barry Goldwater, but he chose to go into the ministry and decided he'd rather change people from the inside out. Um, so he kind of paid a little bit of attention to politics, but it wasn't a main topic of conversation. And certainly, I don't remember him going on and on about black radicals, partially because I don't think it was that much as much of an issue in the Midwest as it was in places like New York and San Francisco. Um, anyway, so here's an interesting figure, Twyman, Twymon, Twyman. I'm probably not saying that name right. Twyman Ford Myers. He was a 20-year-old BLA recruit, and he was one of the most murderous. Yeah, it said he was perhaps the single deadliest revolutionary of the decade. He had been a gang member, a long juvenile record of muggings and robberies. He used a gun more freely than almost anyone else in the BLA. And McCreary, one of the Black Panthers, I think, says Twyman is the baby of 3 or 4 kids, and they were all thugs. Twyman was political, but he was really a gangster. He had done a lot of time in jail, and there was only one clear thing in his mind. He always told me, I will die before I go back in jail. So let's see what happened. They, August 4th, 1971, Twyman Myers and a trio of BLA members burst into a lounge, another one of these social clubs. They robbed $6,000 from the patrons, and they grabbed a gypsy cab to make their escape. Police cars arrived, and the cab got caught in traffic. Myers leaped out from the cab, whipped out a .30 caliber automatic rifle, and began firing wildly up and down the street. The cab driver was hit and killed. Myers threw his gun down and ran for it, and the others surrendered and were charged with murder. They didn't even know this had anything to do with the BLA. And it says, of all the deaths Twyman was involved in, the one with that cab driver bothered him the most. Shot right in the head. Twyman always said that really fucked with him. He always said that motherfucker had nothing to do with anything. I remember when he got back to the safe house that night, the cab had just exploded. The women, they picked car glass out of his hair for 2 or 3 hours. So Twyman and others went on to begin robbing banks. They hit the first one in Queens on July 29th, but that didn't go very well. And then they did a better one, Bankers Trust Branch, on August 23rd, involving half a dozen BLA members. They got about $7,700 that time. Of course, the FBI and the New York PD are all looking for them at this point after the cop killings. Well, I don't know if they knew that they were BLA, the bank robberies.
Well, and one of the details in here that might explain why they were now suddenly looking for them is that whenever they robbed these places, they didn't wear any sort of masks or any other sort of obscurant.
Right.
So
security
they were caught
cameras.
on camera.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe not the brightest group of revolutionaries about to overthrow, the most powerful organization in the world. Get running into somewhere without any sort of obscuring feature, ready to rob for money.
So then New York PD got another bit of random luck. I'm sorry. No, sorry. In San Francisco, let's see, police sergeant was cruising in the Mission District in San Francisco when 2 black men in a dark Oldsmobile stopped in front of him. One opened fire with a submachine gun. They didn't get him, and he chased them. And the Oldsmobile crashed and was surrounded by police. And they arrested Anthony Bottom and Albert Washington, who were Black Panthers. And the 19-year-old Bottom gave them quite a story. He said he was part of a group of Panthers who had staged a series of minor Bay Area bombings stretching back at least a year. They would later be charged with the murder of a San Francisco policeman as well. But what stunned his questioners was when Bottom volunteered that he and Washington had been among 5 San Francisco Panthers who had journeyed east that May and murdered 2 New York policemen, Waverly Jones and Joseph Piagentini. So they arrested a number of those guys. The Bell-Bottom Panthers, they were called. They weren't officially members of the BLA, but they might as well have been. Deruba Moore. They basically, the New York Panthers sort of took credit, but it was actually these San Francisco guys who did it. Yeah, and so Hoover says the FBI is getting more and more concerned. The BLA was fulfilling every warning about black militancy J. Edgar Hoover had made. And he wrote every FBI office on September 24th of 1971. During the past several months, the Cleaver faction of the Black Panther Party, it's not a bad way to refer to the BLA really, has moved on a course of increased violence, lawlessness, and terror. This bureau must approach its investigation of extremist activity with renewed vigor and imagination. So some of the one of the BLA cells had left New York and decided they were going to do some training. They had Joanne Chesmard with them, Twyman Myers, and they had a training camp in Atlanta. To train them to be more effective in their military sort of like action. And so part of their practice was to they would, it was time to begin they did their training. Now it's time to begin the war, and that meant killing policemen. So November 3rd, 1971, they sent Twyman Myers again and Freddie Hilton for the honor of the first kill. Let's see, they killed James Green, Atlanta police officer named James Green, who was having a cup of coffee and a ham biscuit. And they just came out of the shadows and on both sides of the wagon and opened fire on him, and he was killed. They tore off his badge, took his pistol to show, to prove, hey, we did kill a policeman, and then I think they sent out more, but they never killed anybody. Let's see. Yeah, they tried to. They went out. Two more were sent out to kill. Others were sent out to kill another police officer, but it didn't work out. And in fact, yeah, one of them got killed. Anyway, so then 1972, that cell scattered BLA militants across the Southeast. Some of them were in jail. And Twyman Myers and someone else, they grabbed lots of guns and head out. He was arrested. Okay. Yeah, so they kept getting arrested and they kept going. That's the pattern I remember, Ryan, is that these people were getting killed, they were going to prison, and it didn't really it didn't have the effect that the townhouse explosion did on the Weather Underground. It didn't have like that sobering effect. They just kept going,
Right, because these are people that are determined to kill, not people that are determined to blow up capital by rich people to send an intellectual statement or something.
Right.
Whenever a regime clamps down on these types, if they get the leadership or something, it's good for that regime. But you are going to inspire something more from the people that are still committed. You might eventually break them if you get enough of their higher ups or their friends or whatnot. But any serious regime at this point of time would have declared basically a counter war or something like that against them and shot them all dead. We just keep arresting them, keeping them alive, giving hope for some of the younger members and all this other stuff. That definitely fits within the philosophy of our judicial system, but it's not the greatest thing whenever you have a guerrilla war or a troubles or something like that going on in one of your cities.
Yeah, I wanted to mention this detail. The Chesimard chapter, they fled New York from Miami, and here's why. Who was it? I think Chesmard was in the car. Yeah, anyway, they, two patrolmen on December 20th, 1971, they spied 4 people in a green Pontiac, 1 woman and 3 men, parked in front of a banker's trust branch, acting suspiciously. They're casing the bank or whatever, right, for a bank robbery. So when the police car approaches, the Pontiac pulls away. They check its license plate as they're driving and discover the car's been stolen. So they turn on their lights, and the Pontiac takes off. They chase them on the way to Brooklyn. Um, and then someone in the Pontiac rolled down a window and lobbed something toward the cruiser. I just want to pause for a moment and remember that this happened in the United States while I was alive. I wasn't actually in New York at this point, but it
Right.
was of all the
And
thing they
remember,
lobbed. Go ahead.
yeah. I was just gonna say, remember, the greatest thing that has ever threatened the social order and government of this country was people going into the Capitol building, taking pictures with like their grandma, and then leaving after being dispersed. Remember that as we
the,
read off this next sentence.
the thing that was lobbed of all things was a hand grenade, an M26 fragmentation grenade to be exact, the kind used by the U.S. Army in Vietnam. To the officer's amazement, it exploded beside the cruiser and wrecked it. The officers, thankfully, were not hurt. They leaped out of the burning car and the Pontiac got away. Um, and they grabbed a car, switch cars from a man at a gas station, stole his car, and later the man identified Chesmart as one of his assailants. Um, and we're not totally sure that's correct, but possibly. And so the NYPD immediately issued a 13-state alarm calling for her arrest. Chesmard, by the way, under her name Asada Shakur, is held up as a real heroic figure, sort of like Che Guevara, but on a smaller scale. Look around for her name, you'll see there's like T-shirts and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the left holds up its radical elements, right, as people to be emulated.
Yeah, well, they do that because they're allowed to. We aren't.
Yeah, right. Let's see. So the BLA made a first ever phone call to the press. Someone called the United Press International, UPI, took credit in the name of the Attica Brigade of the Afro-American Liberation Army, which was Cleaver's name for the BLA, saying, "We have more grenades and we will be back." So they got out of there. Chesmard and some others got out of there and relocated to the Miami area. And they started looking for banks to hold up. They pulled off a quick bank robbery in Miami, running out in less than 5 minutes. And then they decided to create a string of safe houses across the Midwest. And so they left Miami, scattered to rent apartments in Cleveland, Milwaukee, my own St. Louis, and Kansas City. And then some of them met up with Zaid Shakur, who was still in touch with Algeria. Okay, so where do I want to jump to? Okay, so January 27th, 1972. By the way, part of the thing that's striking to me, Ryan, I'm mentioning the dates very specifically because all this happens really fast. I mean, there's some stuff in this book that goes on later into the 70s, even into the early 80s, but a lot of really crazy stuff. The bombing of the Capitol, shooting at police officers. It all goes down in like months.
Yeah.
A lot of things happen very, very fast in early 1970, early 1971. It's just amazing how much was going on at this time. I just imagine if it had been right-wing radicals doing those exact same things, we would never hear the end of it. It would be in
Right,
every
and
history book. It would be like, the nation was in terror, And the nation was in terror back then, or some parts of it were, because, people, this was news, these things that were happening. And it was really alarming to the police department and to regular people. But then it kind of got flushed down the memory hole. And no one ever told me that 1971, 1972 or 70 through 72 were like a terrible time for America, radical violence in America.
Yeah. And I think a much more powerful rhetorical tool for normal people in American society to use is, these radicals aren't just shooting cops; they are grenading cops.
Yeah.
I think that captures the situation much more than it's just another one of those people from this community that's off on a cop killing rampage. They have military grade weaponry that they are using in a major city. They are grenading cops.
Just amazing. Um, okay, so let's see what happened here. So, oh yeah, this is tragic. Okay, so yeah, Greg, patrolman in New York's East Village, Greg Foster, black man, and Rocco Laurie, white man. They had served together as Marines in Vietnam, and as close friends had received permission to be partners, patrolling one of New York's most dangerous and drug-ridden neighborhoods. Um, and so let's see what happened. Um, they noticed a car. They ducked in, asked the owner of a luncheonette if he knew about the car. They began to walk. Three black men passed them. Um, a moment after the officers passed, the three men suddenly turned and drew pistols, a 38 automatic and two 9mm automatics. Foster and Laurie were a few strides away when the men began firing directly into their backs. Foster was hit 8 times and fell in a heap onto the icy pavement. 6 bullets hit Laurie. I'm not going to go through the gruesomeness of everything, but it was terrible. I do want to mention one detail though. They killed them in a just gruesome way. Two ran toward a car. The third man danced a jig over the dead men's bodies, firing his pistol into the air Wild West style, and then he realized he was alone and then ran off. So this is January 27th, 1972, and we had started with May, right? Yeah. Or no, yeah. May 1971. So once again,
Yeah.
more officers have died. And fingerprints found in the car suggested the assassins were Ronald Carter, Twyman Myers again, and at least one other member of their cell. So, what did police know at this point? 10 officers had now been attacked, and 7 had been killed in a 9-month span in New York, San Francisco, North Carolina, and Atlanta. I think I missed some killings in there, but seemingly all by one-time Panthers claiming to be a Black Liberation Army. Many in the New York Police Department believed this constituted a legitimate national conspiracy, but others felt that the killings were unrelated. This was just a few disgruntled Panthers borrowing a discarded Panther term to make it appear as if there was a big conspiracy. Yeah, it's a little confusing to me, Ryan, like why this argumentation internally about whether it's a conspiracy or not. Anyway,
Well, I mean, we've already shown,
it
and
seems that
this book
like
hasn't
they'd
gone
want to
into.
fight it. They'd want to fight it, or whatever it is. But
Well,
anyway, go ahead.
we've already shown, and this book doesn't go into full detail, but there were elements in political society that had already sided with the Black Panthers, at least implicitly, or explicitly in the case of people like Bernstein. So when you have people claiming to be once upon a time a Black Panther, but now they're part of the Black Liberation Army, which was set up by Black Panthers, that's not good. Especially because you had a narrative that is still around to this day being crafted in the more northern areas that the Black Panthers were just Black citizens that were exercising their Second Amendment rights and doing exactly what the evil whites in the South were and scaring them and intimidating them at the polls. So it's only right that they're allowed to do that. There's nothing against the law for carrying these weapons as a group. It's even written in there for a militia. That narrative is still very much around today. If you come across lefties that know about this, they just pretend that the Black Panther Party were blacks that just so happened to like firearms, who held soft, nice, warm, fuzzy socialist ideas. When in reality, um, you know, people are being grenaded, shot. Um, you missed you didn't read out a vulgarity here, and I won't do it now. But they were basically torturing, going for
Yeah,
the most sadistic means of killing. Uh,
yeah,
it doesn't look good, and it clashes with that narrative that the Black Panthers are just a peaceful group that like firearms. It
right,
doesn't really lend itself.
right. Now, to be fair, this was a splinter off of Huey Newton's Black Panther Party, but you know, it was
Right. It doesn't
former
take
Black
a
Panthers, former Black Panthers,
Yeah.
but yeah,
It doesn't take a college degree to know that one leads to the other.
right. Um, uh, Yeah, so one incident happened in my own St. Louis, in fact. I just have to decide, this is interesting to me. I have to decide how much I need to share. Well, there is a detail here. So they had a safe house set up in St. Louis, and so some of them came to St. Louis. And let's see, Twyman Carter again, or I mean, sorry, Twyman Myers was there, for example. Um, well, he's going to be key. And so they're out in a car, and two St. Louis patrolmen spot a green 1967 Oldsmobile sporting a set of cardboard Michigan license plates. For Michigan, I don't think license plates would have ever been cardboard. That sounds like pretty cheesy
Wait,
because
wait,
cardboard
really?
falls
Is
apart
that
in
what it
rain.
says?
Yeah, page 215 if you have the.
Okay. Yeah, I entirely missed that. Sorry.
Yeah, isn't that nuts? And you can see
Yeah.
the St. Louis policeman going, wait, what? We don't really do license plate out of cardboard. They would not survive the rain. But anyway, so they hit their lights, and the guy who's behind the wheel says, or a guy in the back says, "Hey, be cool, just pull over." And we'd all been taught that if you get stopped, because now they've been doing these trainings and stuff, right? We'd all been taught that if you get stopped, the first thing you do is roll down the car windows. That way, if you have to shoot, you don't want glass exploding all over you. So they all rolled down their windows. The driver took out his wallet. He had everything in his hand, but it wasn't right. The car had Michigan temporary plates. It was registered in Florida. His driver's license was an alias, a North Carolina alias license. And the cop was just like, "What in the heck is going on here?" And he says, "I'm gonna have to ask you guys to step out of the car." And the driver is trying to keep this from getting violent, and it says, "Why is that necessary? Why?" Um, and they all were armed to the teeth. And he says, "I'd been through several situations with Twyman, who was next to him in the front. I knew that when he was about to shoot, he always started rocking back and forth. That detail freaked me out, so I wanted to share it. And I realized he had started rocking in his seat. I'm talking to the cop, and I feel Twyman pulling at my sleeve. He wants me to lean back so he can shoot the cop. I know he's about to shoot. I'm trying everything I can do to make this cop go away. The cop keeps saying, 'Get out of the car.' I keep saying, 'Why is that necessary? All our papers in order. Why is that necessary?' And finally he says, 'Nigger, get out of the fucking car.' And when he said that, I just leaned back. And all I saw then was red and blue streaks of fire going past my face. Twyman was shooting, and then, well, the whole car kind of exploded. So the officer fell, struck in the stomach and legs. As the BLA guys roared off in their car, he fired all 6 shots in his revolver. Some narcotics officers were on a stakeout a block away. They heard the shooting. They gave chase. Anyway, one of them got one of the guys in the car got killed by all this firing. He had been shot in the chest, actually by one of the other BLA guys in the car. Ended up killing his own fellow. And then the driver just went to a chain link fence and surrendered. Yeah, a bunch of them just ended up surrendering. But Twyman Myers got away, disappearing into the night. Oh, and one of the pistols that was thrown down had belonged to Officer Rocco Laurie in New York. And so this changed things because the New York Police Department had been kind of keeping quiet about possible connections for political reasons. They didn't want to make a big deal out of it. But once that happened, once they found that pistol in St. Louis from the slain officer, they felt they had to reveal everything they knew. So they had a press conference. And let's see. Here's what they said. Intelligence fails to identify a formal structure of a firm organization known as the Black Liberation Army. It is more likely that various extremist individuals, 75 to 100 in number, are making use of the name Black Liberation Army in order to give some semblance of legitimacy to these homicidal acts. these individuals form and dissolve and reform in small groups or cells, which wasn't a totally terrible take on what was going on. They weren't
Right.
giving it full credence, but the forming and dissolving and reforming in small cells, that actually is what was happening with the BLA at this time. Go ahead.
Right. And if you are the police, you know, you've gotten people that quite frankly seem to be crazy by some of the descriptions in here. So when you look at the people they do know and their background and what they believe, it seems likely from their point of view that it would just be a bunch of crazy people wanting to kill, just for the sake of killing. There's no way that they would have known that there's an ideology or a history behind
Mm-hmm.
this.
Right.
So yeah, not a terrible take at all.
I mean, except for the communiques, which were very political, right? But anyway,
Oh well,
um,
yeah, but they don't exactly say like we have a set structure, we're going to do this and do that. It was
yeah,
more of
yeah,
them just saying you're all are fascists, we hate you, and we're going to kill more of you, which
right.
fits what they were doing as crazies.
Yep. So the New York Times had been skeptical about this BLA thing being real, but the headline of its front page story on February 17th was Evidence of Liberation Army said to rise. And then he says, it was then, with its notoriety near a zenith, that the BLA went utterly silent. Not a single word would be heard again for months. And now there's a chapter where he gives a little bit of an update on the Weather Underground, and I think, didn't they end up getting arrested? I wasn't going to hit too much more on that story, but at some point, some
They
of them got
definitely,
arrested.
the head was definitely cut off of the snake, if I from what I read, but maybe I just didn't read far enough.
Yeah, I thought that's what happened. Um, I thought they captured Dorn because didn't she had been on FBI's Most Wanted for a while. I thought they did end up catching her. Let's see. Sorry, just in case there's anything there, but I just wanted to finish up the BLA story with the last chapter on them. Oh, okay, yeah. The FBI was doing all kinds of illegal stuff and trying to catch the Weather Underground, and so oh yeah, Mark Felt, isn't that an important name, by the way? Wasn't he Deep Throat? I
Uh,
thought we found out who Deep Throat was in the Watergate
did
stuff.
we?
Yeah, I thought it was
That's
Mark Felt.
so.
Take a look.
Yeah, I'll be perfectly honest. I usually ignore most of that because um, I'm sure most people have heard my take on Watergate right now. The thing that's interesting to me from this chapter, is that it was terrorism in Munich for the Olympic Games that finally got Nixon to tell everyone, all right, we need an all-out campaign against, the people that
Oh,
are killing and mutilating everyone here.
I didn't catch that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're talking about the assassination of the Israeli athletes in Munich.
Well, I would presume that's what it's referencing here. But um, I, I suppose when things start to go international, that would seem to be more of a cause. But I don't know. I feel like if I was the president and I looked at the newspaper and it was like, you know, cops grenaded in American City, you would think that would be when things started to break down. But
There's a lot
apparently
of
it
crazy
took
stuff.
assassinations.
Yeah, a lot of
Yeah,
crazy
apparently
stuff
it took
going down.
assassinations in Munich. Uh,
Um, right.
so
Okay, I didn't
hunted
catch
to
that.
exhaustion is what the directive says.
Mm-hmm. Right. Anyway, so let's finish up the Black Liberation Army in what happened in 1973. Here again, a poem by Joanne Chesmart, aka Asada Shakur. I understand I am slightly out of fashion. The in crowd wants no part of me. Someone said that I am 260s, black. Someone else told me I had failed to mellow. So, yeah, so he says, year 1973 was pivotal in post-war U.S. history. The year the Vietnam War was effectively lost. So that's not the final departure of the U.S., but he's just saying that that's militarily when things had taken a turn for the worse, I guess. Watergate
Right.
scandal unraveled. The 60s era finally ended. The wave of student uprisings and radicalism ran its course. The movement was dead. Abby Hoffman was arrested on arrested on drug charges. He went underground. Um, Huey Newton fled to Cuba. Timothy Leary was arrested in Afghanistan. He gave grand jury testimony against the Weather Underground. Really? Sort of surprised about that. Anyway. Oh,
And
the wait a sec. A couple other things.
yeah,
Um, the government of Algeria finally threw the Panthers out of their beloved embassy in Algeria, and so Eldridge Cleaver ended up in Paris, and he said the revolution was over. He had lost. Go ahead.
yeah. So the 1970s, you see an interesting, or the 1973 in particular, you see an interesting turn in America. Nixon won, I think, in the second largest landslide in United States history. He only lost, was it Minnesota? I think it was, or Massachusetts. I forget which landslides are which. He only lost one state, um, and basically, he took that as a mandate that you know everything to do with sort of like the civil rights, radicalism, hippies, drugs, sex, the complete destruction of traditional morality, and all this other stuff had been firmly rejected, and they were just going to go full steam ahead. And so did the Democratic Party, where they started turning to their more moderate or even conservative wings,
Hmm.
because up until now the party had been absolutely hijacked by the more northern, usually radicals, with some southern sympathizers that were far and few in between. The Dixiecratic bloc had been sidelined from all forms of power, basically, except for like
Mm-hmm.
economic populism, stuff that didn't really matter. Um, at about this point in time is when the Democratic Party would start opening up to post civil rights era leaders, like that would eventually lead to the likes of, say, Jimmy Carter, who presented himself as a more of a sometimes a conservative or a moderate. He
Mm-hmm.
wasn't going to get into all of the crazy radicalism of the civil rights era. He just wanted everyone to get along.
Right.
The same rhetoric that you would get from from a president trying to make peace in what is essentially now a war-torn country. Uh,
Right.
that's the mood that you're seeing on the political scale, and that's what you're seeing with the Richard Nixon administration as well. It's not just in the one party; it's both.
Right. Right. So. So now the last chapter. He says the BLA's last chapter began in the darkness before dawn on October 23rd, 1972. Um, 7 men were busy at work in the Manhattan House of Detention with hacksaw blades. Um, and one was Anthony Kimu, Kimu, Kimu White, a 24-year-old BLA recruit. He'd been in jail since taking part in the Harlem shootout that helped give birth to the BLA in April 1971. So after a head count, they sawed through 4 steel bars in their fourth floor cell area. And let's see, I think they all got away. Yeah. It was the first escape from the tomb since it opened in 1941. And it invigorated what remained of the Black Liberation Army in New York. So Kimu White got out. He hooked up with his comrades. Um, Twyman Myers was there, and some of the others. And it says, to the extent that these last survivors had any true leadership, it had fallen to the unlikeliest field marshal in the annals of black revolutionaries, 25-year-old Joanne Chesimard, who was poised to become the most wanted female in New York history. And she was called lots of things. The New York Daily News dubbed her Sister Love. The NYPD began referring to her as the heart and soul of the BLA. This was a little exaggerated, but no one could deny she became a defining symbol of the underground era. And that's why I compared her to Che Guevara, because you'll see her photo used as pictures of her used as sort of a symbol of, radicalism. Um, yeah, it says, oh, right. He says, in time, Chesimard's visage would hang alongside those of Che Guevara and Malcolm X on the walls of scores of revolutionary venues. So, if you're hanging out in a revolutionary bookstore somewhere sometime, and you see the Malcolm X and Che Guevara, inevitable Che Guevara and Malcolm X posters, and you see a black woman next to them, now you know it's Assata Shakur. Okay. So let's see what happened. I don't think I've got this prepared as well as I had the other chapters. Ha! Okay, gonna have to stumble
Well, yeah,
along.
and
Okay,
it might be worth noting while you go and find that a
yeah.
lot of these movements, especially in the new left types, as we already said, they're much more outwardly intellectual than perhaps the Bolsheviks were, that were relying more on real strategy. The New Left was a very uh, and whether or not the executors were college educated, they had their origins in some forms of academia. One of the things they need is symbols in order to have their movement. So Che Guevara, you're going to see him for the New Left in the more Latin countries. You're going to see Malcolm X and other black radicals in the United States, and then in many post-colonial countries. Uh, you're going to see something similar as well. Ho Chi Minh might come to mind, not necessarily fully associated with the New Left, but not exactly an old-fashioned Bolshevik either.
Mhm.
Mao Zedong, very similar. So that that's uh that's why this is important. It's not getting into like celebrity statuses here in the book. This is by the New Left themselves and their associates. This is considered something very vital is to have a figure.
Um, so I wanted to mention this. The author, Brian Burroughs here, he tells the police side of the story a lot, as much as he can piece that together. As well, I've been focusing more on the what the terrorists themselves are doing. But I just thought this was interesting as a foreshadowing of much more of this to come. Um, he says there were no fewer than 8 groups were hunting the BLA at the beginning of 1973. Detective squads in Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx, plus district attorneys in Brooklyn and Queens, apparently without talking to one another, much less the FBI. So you got all these different police departments and the FBI, and they're not even communicating or anything. The NYPD was further hamstrung by 2 bugaboos of mid 1970s policing. The department's newfound sensitivities about race and a lengthy corruption inquiry. So, what's this race thing? Um, Somebody comes in and says, what's the problem? Why aren't we getting anywhere catching these BLA guys? And one of them says, you want to know what's wrong? I'll tell you. The bosses won't turn us loose. We have a dozen leads. They won't let us follow. Did you know we aren't allowed to go into Harlem after dark? The deputy chief of detectives is afraid we'll cause a riot or shoot someone. It might ruin his chance for promotion. Another guy says, did you know we have a tap on Twyman Meyer's mother's phone? Last week, we hear her telling her niece that she was going to meet baby. That's Twyman. He's the baby of the family, right? Here she's going to meet the guy we know has killed a half dozen cops, and we couldn't tail her because it was nighttime in Harlem. So that situation gets fixed, and they start pursuing some leads. One involved Woody Green and Kimmy White, that escaped from the tombs. They learned that Woody Green's wedding anniversary was January 23rd, and they were certain he would want to go see his wife. So they followed his wife, and they spotted Green walking into a bar to meet with her. And 2 detectives were sent in to confirm the identification of Green. They made eye contact with Green, and Green and White just drew pistols and opened fire. They didn't wait. So 2 detectives got shot. Let's see what ended up happening. I mean, they're shooting back and forth at each other with patrons in the bar and everything. It's just insane, this stuff, what that went on.
It's not like a television show where the shooting happens in like an abandoned neighborhood at dark. Like this
Right.
is
Yeah,
when I made the
people are
comparison to
around.
the Troubles. Yeah, when I made the comparison to the Troubles earlier, part of that is that this is happening in what might be considered society. There are
Yeah,
other people there living their lives, and then
right.
suddenly
Yeah,
black terrorists.
yeah, and there's just a shootout going on in your bar. Let's see. So they shot back and forth. Oh, and they did kill both Kimu White and Green, and none of the other patrons miraculously were injured. Um, Yeah. And see, this is the part that confuses me. This is the part that is so telling of how crazy these times were. It says, to the press, it was just another BLA shootout. The Daily News carried the story on page 8, while the Times chose page 48. So this is like absolute like war in here in America, and they're just like, oh yeah, another shootout, whatever. Um, uh,
It's the
but
wrong kind of terrorism.
yeah, right. Um, but it says to Joanne Chesmart and the remaining members of the BLA, it was as if the NYPD had violated a months-long ceasefire. Um, so Chesmart got a strategy meeting together in the Bronx. She argued for immediate retaliation. Zaid Shakur and some others agreed. They stole a car. They in Brooklyn. They had the guns. Um, and let's see. Uh, Officers Carlo and Vincent Imperato. I feel like a lot of Italians end up getting killed, Ryan. Italian police
Well,
officers.
they're the ones that are going to go into the police force because that's going to be the I'm not going to accuse them all of having mafia connections and whatnot else, but they are a very communal people.
Mm-hmm.
They're all going to go into about the same industry.
Mm-hmm.
The police force is going to be the thing that suits them the best. You can see this even in early political machines. Going back into the late 1800s, you had ethnic groups that would go into the same profession just because that's where everyone else was. That's where the political machine was. That's where the political power was. That's where the path to promotion was. Italians going into the police force, pretty similar.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, these are two brothers. I missed that. Officers Carlo and Vincent Imperato, brothers. So he just pulls up to a red light, glances over, and sees a black man in a raincoat stepped out of a parked car and aim an automatic rifle directly at him. And it was a BLA guy, Melvin Kearney. Carlo yells, "Duck!" Um, and bullets shatter the driver's side window. Carlo gets hit in the left shoulder. Flying glass gets his brother's arm. His brother starts shooting, and Carlo starts whipping out of there. Kearney keeps firing. Police would find 23 bullet casings scattered on the pavement. The brothers drove themselves to the hospital where they were treated and released. Now that got a headline. Cop brothers shot in Brooklyn ambush in the Daily News. Um, and everyone assumed by now they're getting it. Everyone assumed it was the BLA. And so now they're back in the front pages. The New York Times asks the central question: are there really organized cells of blacks dedicated to the ambush of urban patrolmen? Or if nothing that extensive, are there a handful of guerrilla assassins moving from city to city and getting help from friends along the way? Talk of conspiracy has become virtually a reflex response to such incidents in the last few years, and yet in no single case has it ever been substantiated. So let's see. They plotted a follow-up attack. The reason being, as Avon White, who had been involved with it, told the NYPD months later, the pigs did not die in Brooklyn. They wanted to kill cops, not just injure them. So 2 nights later, the group split into 2 squads to hunt and kill a cop. Let's see. Did anyone actually kill anyone? Yeah, a patrol car containing 2 officers stepped up. All 3 men whipped out their guns and began firing. The officer ducked down, hit the gas. He just got grazed. His partner suffered a shoulder wound. So those 2 guys survived. But now that was 2 attacks in 53 hours. And now they're really freaking out. They say it's a crisis situation. And the newspapers begin to change the tone. Yeah, Liberation Unit rated as murderous. It said rated.
Which
Liberation Unit
yeah,
rated as murderous. Go ahead.
That's supposed to be like the new tone shift. They're finally getting onto this, and they're like, "Oh, it's the Liberation Unit, and they're murderous." In the modern day, if it was a right wing variant, it would be something like rabid supremacist terrorists ravage the United States or something like that.
Right, right.
Uh, they're still willing to use the happy language of liberation. They're only going to call them murderous, not terroristic.
Right, right.
Rated instead of declared, a much softer, more intellectual word. Um, you know, call me crazy. I don't think that the media really cares that it's the left wing terrorists. I think that they are perfectly happy with downplaying the story, as we might know by the fact that barely anyone knows that this happened.
Yeah, right. And even at the time, they're resisting putting two and two together. So Robert Daley, I didn't really talk about him, but he had been one who had been saying, "Hey, we should really be." He had been a spokesman for the NYPD, and he had really wanted to let everybody know that what they were seeing that they hadn't revealed. And so he wrote a book called Target Blue. New York Magazine published an excerpt from it 2 weeks after these attacks on police officers. Um, so he laid bare the story of the 1971 New York and San Francisco attacks, argued they were the work of a single nationwide militant group. And so for the first time, the debate over the BLA washed into the national press, although a lot of people remained skeptical. So one guy in a review in Washington Monthly said, "Conspiracy claims by the cops have a bad habit of collapsing. A top police investigator of the recent assaults has said of the conspiracy theory, a few dozen guys in different places happen to know each other and share a certain affinity. So one of them sits down at a typewriter and taps out BLA, but in numbers and an administrative structure that they don't make it an army." But he's saying the irony is that Daley was pretty much correct. It wasn't
Yeah,
exactly an army, but it was real. It was a multi-state conspiracy, if a bit sloppy.
and that's something funny. It's because when you have multiple coincidences, you might start calling it a pattern, and most people will just fight this tooth and nail if it doesn't really match with what they want it to be. So in this case, right after the civil rights era, when we were pushing through this legislation that was going to make everyone get along. We were going to end evil segregation, and those were the only violent ones, were the segregationists. And then suddenly, after they got basically everything they wanted, you get black terror groups saying that they're going to take over the country. Of course, when the press starts to has to release this, at this point in time, if you're having multiple people being gunned down in the middle of the street, if the press doesn't release it, it's going to get out one way or another, and it's going to be much worse. And then you're going to have other people in the media just saying, "Oh, I don't know if it's really an army." I mean, sure, they all know each other, they all came from the same place, they keep organizing these things, they share the same money, they rob the same places, but it's not an army. It's just a guerrilla unit that uses the same name. It's there's a lot of mental gymnastics that gets performed here.
So in the midst of all this, things keep happening. A single day, March 6th, brought a pair of Bronx shootings. In the first, police tried to stop a gypsy cab they believed had been carjacked. When the car pulled over, three men jumped out and sprayed the cruiser with gunfire. This may well have been Twyman Myers and two Confederates. 20 minutes earlier, a pair of patrolmen cruising 168th Street thought they recognized Myers. When they called him by name, he ran. At Franklin Avenue, he tried to flag a cab. When the cab wouldn't stop, Myers turned and fired a pistol at the pursuing officers. One got out and chased Myers on foot through crowds until, after running for blocks, Myers vanished. "It was him," Hoy said later. "I know his picture better than my own kids." This is getting to be a big deal. Um, and he talks about various false alarm stuff going on as well, because everybody's getting really tense. But then they get a break. Joanne Chesmard and Zaid Shakur. What happened? Let's see. They were trying to escape the police dragnet in New York. They were breaking every rule of underground survival. They were driving in a car. They were driving at night. And worst of all, they were driving on the New Jersey Turnpike, a highway then as now where state troopers had a reputation for stopping and searching cars driven by black men. So let's see. Trooper rolled the lights. Clark Squire was the driver. He pulled to the side. Trooper called for backup before approaching the car. He later said he stopped the car because it had a faulty taillight. um, let's see. He took Squire's driver's license and asked him to stand behind the car with the other trooper. He noticed that the woman sitting in the front seat seemed fidgety. The small, light-skinned man in the back seat sat frozen, his eyes glassy. And then one of them said, "Hey, look what I found," and he held up a clip from an automatic pistol. He turned his attention back to the man and the woman inside the car, told them not to move. He saw Joanne Chesmart reach beneath her right leg. A moment later, the gun was in her hand. She fired from barely 3 feet away. He got hit in the shoulder, fired several shots into the car, and hit both Chesmart and Zaid Shakur. Shakur was hit right in the chest. That was his mortal wound. Let's see. And then the guy who was out of the car started grappling with the trooper, grabbed his gun and shot the officer with his own gun, the trooper with his own, shot him in the head with his own gun. And then the remaining officer ran for it. Let's see. And then, they found Chesmart lying beside the car, bleeding lightly from a wound in the chest, and Shakir, who was dead. Her picture, which we did not use for the cover, but could have. The next day, Joanne Chesmart's face, puffy with full lips and a medium afro, stared out from the front of every New York newspaper. The Daily News coverage spread across 6 pages, 2 just of photos. It was a singular moment in underground history, the first time the press was obliged to introduce and attempt to explain a black revolutionary, and an attractive woman at that, to a mainstream audience. They termed Chesmart not only the high priestess of the cop-hating Black Liberation Army, but a black Joan of Arc. The Times called her the soul of the BLA. But it remained a New York story. It didn't really. Her legend spread later. Go ahead.
Right, and I was just going to go on to the next part, but by all means continue to carry
go
on
ahead.
because it's
Go ahead.
well, the book goes on and it starts to detail how Chesamart's capture was really bad for the BLA because even though they weren't technically hierarchical, that was sort of the unofficial leader, if you will. Um, and the one of the BLA members they wrote in their diary, each day only brings more bad news, more deaths, more captures. Old friends hit the dust, and we are helpless, in touch with nothing but the TV, sexless but comrades. That's sort of that's what they're thinking about, after they've been, murdering multiple people, they themselves have been shot at. That's what comes out of them, and then they go on. I don't know if they are, if Jackson, the person that they were writing about, is turning himself in, is the answer. But to keep running seems futile. In the end, jail or death is the resolution, so why postpone it? Their morale has been absolutely and completely broken, and this is a trend that you can see not just among more radical left groups, but also in the right, where you will see people completely black pill, is what we now call it. But I think you can see here uh, the futility might not have been so clear, especially considering that the police and the government itself had absolutely no idea what was going on at the time. They just knew that they were fighting a low level war. And they themselves were absolutely terrified. So there's sort of futility here. If you were looking at it from their perspective, would have done them in. It was a very big low, but it wasn't absolutely devastating, like, say, in other wars where they capture the actual leader or they push all of them out of the country or something to that effect. That hadn't happened yet. They had just basically started to give up, at least in the terms of their morale.
Right. So how it ends here is that they get an informant finally. They'd been wanting to get an informant, and they got one. She was a jailed BLA member's girlfriend. She faced charges, and so she began cooperating with the FBI to avoid the charges against her. Um, Her identity has never been revealed. It's withheld here as well. She's alive and today and in her 60s. She's helped them find out about a meeting between Freddie Hilton and Twyman Myers, right? Who had killed so many. Let's see. Yeah, things kind of went crazy here.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that this has only been like 2 years. This entire low-level war that has been fought this is 2 years. Who knows what would have happened if they just kept brushing it off as this isn't real. This is just a bunch of
Yeah.
weird killers. There's no such thing as an army here. They're all just loons.
Um, so they caught Freddy, but Twyman Myers got away again. This guy is like the amazing escape artist. But then they arrested the one guy who did give himself, or they did catch him. Let's see. Yeah, they caught Melvin Kearney. They caught Avon White. So a lot of the BLA was now off the streets, and now they wanted to catch Twyman Myers. Here we go. Yeah, I'm going to share this a little bit to wrap this story up. Let's see. Yes, they're trying to find where to catch this guy on November 14th, 1973, right? They figured out that the occupants of a place had to be Myers and his girlfriend. The NYPD and the FBI sent every man they had. By early afternoon, when the girlfriend left the building and was positively identified, there were nearly 150 policemen and federal agents in the area. About a dozen undercover men on the avenue itself, armed with flak jackets, shotguns, automatic weapons. They were ready for war. Finally, a man wearing a ski cap emerged from the building. He looked like Myers. It was Myers. Unaware of the small army around him, I'm just going to read to the end here to wrap us up. Unaware of the small army around him, he strolled around the corner on 152nd Street, then disappeared into a bodega. When he came out, a detective named Colonel Holland was closest to him. Holland knew that Myers usually carried an automatic pistol beneath his coat. When Myers turned down the street, Holland stepped forward, grabbed his arm, and barked, "Freeze, police." Myers wheeled. His eyes met Holland's and widened. He took 2 steps back, pulled a 9mm submachine gun, and opened fire. Holland rolled to the pavement and shot back. The quiet Bronx neighborhood exploded as FBI men and plainclothesmen up and down the street drew their guns and fired. Wounded, Myers wildly fired his 9mm, then frantically drew a second submachine gun from beneath his coat. It was no use. No one could have survived the blizzard of bullets directed his way. Twyman Myers, out for a stroll on a cold New York night, was cut to pieces. It's reminding me of the movie, The Two Gangsters. There's this horrific scene where they finally catch the male and female.
You're not talking about Bonnie and Clyde, are you?
Bonnie and Clyde, yeah. There's this horrific scene where they show them just completely destroyed by the cops shooting them gazillion times, But similar thing with Twyman Myers here. The funeral of Twyman Myers in Harlem made a deep impression on any number of white radicals who attended. The young Italian immigrant Silvia Baraldini, who would later rob banks alongside black militants, gave a friend a religious icon to place inside the coffin. You had to run this gauntlet of police sharpshooters to go into the funeral, she remembers. Seeing all these sharpshooters on practically every rooftop in Harlem, you realized there really was a war going on. I think that was the day I decided to join them. It was over, the shooting at least. A few stragglers would pull a bank job or two in coming months, but the BLA's days as a legitimate urban guerrilla force were at an end. The trials of its members would stretch on for years, with 1 or 2 serving as rallying points for what remained of the radical underground. The memory of the BLA itself blurred and then dimmed, and then in the minds of an American public that took little notice of it anyway, winked out altogether. Even in custody, BLA fighters refused to surrender. Henry Shaw Brown, captured in St. Louis, managed to escape but was recaptured a week later. Melvin Kearney, held on the 8th floor of the Brooklyn House of Detention, tied together bed sheets and shimmied out a window. only to fall to his death when they unraveled. 42 years later, 6 one-time BLA fighters remain alive in U.S. prisons. The murders of Greg Foster and Rocco Laurie of the NYPD remain officially unsolved. Of the dozens of one-time Panthers who served in the BLA, only a handful would soldier on, and only one would make his mark doing so. In 1973, still a fugitive, still the only veteran of Eldridge Cleaver's Algerian adventure vowing to continue the struggle, the man known as Sekou Odinga melted into the shadows of New York City, and with a handful of recruits began robbing banks. And that finishes up the BLA, and the next bit is about the Symbionese Liberation Army, which is really nuts. That I did hear about, I have to say, Ryan, because of the...
oh, really?
Yeah, there's a rich girl who gets involved with the whole thing, and that became big news. So I remember when I was young hearing about some... Anyway, next time.
Yep, that'll be fun. Yeah.
Okay, wanted to give that its due. Maybe too ambitious trying to get all this done in one episode, but at least we got through it and everybody could hear us, I think. So that's really nice. Let's cover a couple of super chats from Lady of Shalott, who has a channel on YouTube. Lady of Shalott would not know this because I don't think she hangs out on Twitter, but I was promoting her channel. She writes, first, turn on, tune in, drop out. David Crosby has passed away at age 81. He was a linchpin of the Laurel Canyon scene, which fed into the terror of the 1970s. Oh, that's interesting. I did not know that he could be tied to some of this violence. And then she says, such groups draw people who love to kill. In the 70s, the loyalist paramilitary UVF in Ulster had the Shankill Butcher Gang, who were serial killers. Yeah, I mean, that's the issue, right? Like, who is doing something that we might view, at least on some level, as legitimate military action, and who gets into it just because they like to kill and they just start killing people, and it has no tactical purpose. They just, you know, they've crossed that line, and now they're just shooting people or torturing people and all kinds of horrible things, right? The monster is released.
And that happens in especially low-level wars, because in conventional warfare, at the very least, you can you have methods to control who is acting illegally and bloodthirstily and all this other stuff, and who is just prosecuting a war. In a low-level war, where things are oftentimes very blocked out of the public, kept secret, very shady activities, opposed to open and on-the-ground warfare. Not that, grenading cop cars isn't open and on-the-ground warfare. It's just that wasn't really hitting the news very much. You get a lot more shady types that are going to be drawn to that, some of which are going to be serial killers. A lot of these Soviet and post-Soviet countries had to deal with a wave of serial killers, stretching from I believe it would be 1960 all the way until about 2000. Just because they could cross between the countries. It was very difficult to find them because a lot of these places were just rural farmland that wasn't really doing much. The Soviet security forces themselves were really good at finding counter-revolutionaries, weren't really good at finding serial killers. And I think one of them either set a record or is in the second record for like the most people killed by a serial killer. And I think it's somewhere in like the 60s, if I remember correctly. It was a Ukrainian. Could be wrong on that, but he was like a Ukrainian and a child molester that was specifically involved in what the Soviets thought was a potential either uprising or organization that they weren't equipped to deal with, because it was just a serial killer. And then in the United States side, we were really good at dealing with people like serial killers and other murderers, bank robbers, and whatnot else. But you saw the reaction from politicians, coastal elites, anything similar, even leaders of police departments. They could not believe that there could have been organized military or revolution in the United States, nor did they want to. So you kind of see both sides of the coin there.
Yeah, not the top, but I see for scanning over the Wikipedia page, list of serial killers by number of victims. I see 4 from well, one's post-Soviet, Russia from 1992 to 2010. He's in position number 4 by number of victims. Proven victims 78, possibly a few
Yeah.
more. Then there was Andrei Chikatilo, 53 victims between
Yeah.
1978 and 1990. Yeah, then another post-Soviet one, and then 1934 to 1935. Who is that? Anyway, the guy with the who killed the most people that we know of says out of that area, he was called the werewolf.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Um,
uh, this is a you have a few famous examples from the Americas, but you don't really hear stuff like that, and it's because our force was equipped to deal with them. The Soviets were not. But the
mm,
Soviets were very much equipped to deal with ideological enemies, and we weren't. Um,
mm.
it's just that serial killers are a much more popular media topic now. You can get a lot of money on podcasting about them.
Yeah.
Talking about the one time where the black radicals, too emboldened by the civil rights movement, tried to take over your country doesn't really get a lot of good publicity, and you might get called a racist for pointing it out.
Right. Okay. At the danger of trying everyone's patience, just wanted to. Oh yeah, I'll give you the title of that book. It's called Days of Rage. Is the book we're drawing from here. I wanted to mention that I'm a little late as usual getting my act together and getting the prizes out for the art contest, but I just purchased the last silver coins I needed to purchase to start shipping prizes out. And I got to get it from someone who is an interesting person. He has a connection. He was mentored to some degree by a much older man named Eric Newman. Eric Newman was a top numismatist. Quickly going down the econ geek hole for a moment, nerd route here. Eric Newman was interesting. He lived until he was 106. He made a lot of money working in the coin business, collectible coin business. And I saw his collection. I just stumbled on it at Washington University. It had been under the art gallery. And I was like, I saw a little sign. I was like, oh, what's that? Went downstairs. It just seemed like totally obscure, like you wouldn't even know it was there. The Newman Money Museum, just this incredible collection. Oh, I'm supposed to be sharing links here. I meant to be sharing links. This is a link to Eric Newman. This is, unfortunately, I don't think the Newman Money Museum is on display. They had it in the library for a while, and now I think it's probably in storage or something. But he also funded the Newman Numismatic Portal, which is hosted by Washington University right there. And if you have an interest in that sort of thing, I think you'll find the Newman Numismatic Portal quite amazing, an amazing resource. Certainly when I stumbled on his collection, I was like, oh, wow. And it wasn't just coin. It was, he actually collected paper dollars, which, you know, are not as exciting as a valuable old silver coin or gold coin, right? But is kind of neat, right? Because you saw Confederate dollars and you saw greenbacks and all kind of it's for someone interested in American history. Oh, and oh, by the way, Ryan, he wasn't just interested in numismatics and wanted to start this Newman Numismatic Portal to encourage that, but particularly to encourage knowledge about American money. That was his specialty and his focus. So that's a really great resource if you are trying to figure out how something looked in Texas. The coins looked in Texas before they joined the Union, or so. It's probably all in there. So.
Yeah, I was about to ask if it was still on display because that sounds very interesting. But yeah, that's just the way that these things go. I'll have to check those things out.
Yeah. So anyway, just wanted to share about that. So little time getting those silver coins, but I got to make a cool connection in the process, which will pay off in the future. Okay, so I think that is all. Any further comments, Ryan? This just is blowing my mind. I'm still absorbing. I'm sharing this with you guys, but I'm also still absorbing the reality of just how crazy it was. Well, kind of in the post-war period, because like with the Jim Jones stuff, that really starts in the 50s.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's crazy stuff going on. Pretty pretty quick. But then by the mid 60s to the early 70s, I mean, just insanity that we've been learning about. The behavior
It
of some people is just off the charts, you know?
The amount of absolutely insane malice that happens after or during this period makes one wonder if perhaps the nation's being judged for some sort of unrighteousness. But that would be a topic for another time.
Yeah, right. Okay, thanks everyone. I believe. Oh yeah, no, Black Horse is on vacation, so I need to confirm, but we may be doing a special econ stream next week with a guest who has written a couple articles on the petrodollar, and is I think we can have a pretty good discussion about the post about starting like 1973, how U.S. established this new form of dollar dominance using commodities, oil and other commodities, and sort of what's been happening to that just recently, because that's gotten quite interesting. I don't know if you've been catching this. We've tried to highlight it a bit on Econ Minis, but in the midst of all the things going on with Russian sanctions on Russia and stuff like that, there are competitors arising to the dominance of the U.S. dollar, which is a real problem for the U.S. empire. It's not a problem for me personally, but it's a problem for the U.S. empire. So I need to confirm that guest, but ideally that's what we'll do next week, and then we'll continue with this series. If Ryan's available, we'll continue with the Symbionese Liberation Army, which will blow your mind. It's just insane. And it doesn't even, it goes past the 70s. As I recall, I think that story ends in the 80s. Like, yeah, I remember the 80s. I mean, this is crazy.
So I haven't actually read it yet. I just know very vague basics about them. So I will be learning this in time for the next show. I'm excited.
I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry. Symbionese Liberation Army is 73 to 75. We'll get into some stuff that happens up into almost the mid 80s as we finish up the book. But just insanity. That our childhood, my childhood, not your childhood, my childhood. It was going on. Okay, thanks everybody. And for those who hung in there this whole time, I am impressed. I hope you found it interesting. All right, talk to you all later.